Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we are going to slip quietly into one of the strangest chapters of the past, an age that dressed itself up in silk and lace and powder, smiled politely, and underneath all of that was, frankly, a bit of a nightmare. This is Georgian England, roughly the years between 1714 and the 1830s, an era remembered for elegant townhouses, string quartets, and gentlemen bowing low over a lady's gloved hand. And all of that is true. But it sat directly on top of overflowing cesspits, gin-soaked mornings, and a level of everyday cruelty that most people at the time barely noticed, because it was simply how things were done. Before we go wandering into this candle-lit, gin-scented, slightly dangerous century, a quiet thank you to everyone who keeps this channel going. If stories like this help you drift off at night, consider leaving the video running in the background. And if you feel like it, a like or a comment costs nothing and helps more than you'd think. Tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight. It's always strange to think how many different time zones are quietly dozing off to the same voice. Now settle in. Turn the lights down low. Let your shoulders drop. Tonight we are going to imagine waking up as an ordinary person in Georgian England, no title, no fortune, just an ordinary soul trying to get through an ordinary day in a century that made almost nothing easy. We'll follow that day from the first bleary waking moment on a rented mattress, through the streets, the shops, the doctor's office, the marketplace, and all the way to nightfall. Along the way we'll meet gin sellers and grave robbers, quack doctors and press gangs, powdered aristocrats and children sent up chimneys. It is, by turns, absurd, unsettling, and quietly heartbreaking. So take a deep breath, carefully. The air in a moment will not thank you for it, and let's begin. It is somewhere around 1760, and you are opening your eyes in the dark. The first thing you notice is not where you are, but who else is there, a stranger's shoulder pressed against yours, the sour heat of someone else's breath, the creak of old timber shifting under too much weight. You have not woken up in a room of your own. You have woken up in a corner of someone else's floor, one body among a dozen, all of you strangers who happen to have the same few coins the night before. This is a common lodging house, and if you are poor in Georgian London, and most people are, this is where your night has been spent. For a few pence you get a patch of a shared mattress, stuffed with straw that has seen better decades. For less than that, you don't even get to lie down. In the cheapest houses, the landlord strings a length of rope across the room at chest height, and for a single penny you are permitted to lean over it and doze upright, propped like washing on a line. At sunrise he simply walks along and cuts the rope, and every sleeper collapses at once. It is, in its own grim way, an alarm clock. Look around you if you dare, though the darkness is doing you something of a favor. The room was built to comfortably hold perhaps 6 people. Tonight it is holding closer to 20. There are no proper sheets, no pillows to speak of, and the one blanket available has clearly been the subject of many quiet nighttime tugs of war. The air is thick, a blend of unwashed bodies, spilled spirits, damp plaster, and the particular staleness of a room that has never once been allowed to breathe. You are not alone in this bed in more ways than one. The straw beneath you is home to a small, thriving population of fleas and lice, who have long since stopped being surprised by new arrivals. Something rustles in the wall. Something drips, somewhere, from a source you decide firmly not to investigate. The floor has a stickiness to it that your imagination is better off not explaining. The whole building creaks and settles through the night like an old ship that gave up sailing long ago and simply floats now, going nowhere. There is a strange arithmetic to Georgian poverty, and you have just lived through the harshest version of it. A proper bed costs money you don't have, so you take whatever is cheapest, even if cheapest means folding your body over a rope like a piece of drying laundry until your spine screams and your legs go numb. You dare not fall asleep so deeply that you slip, because falling means waking, and waking this early means facing the day sooner than you'd like. It is the 18th century's answer to the cheapest possible night's stay, except the establishment has no particular interest in your comfort, only your penny. When the gray light finally creeps through the shutters, the landlord moves through the room the way a farmer moves through a barn at dawn, brisk, indifferent, entirely used to the scene. The rope is cut. Bodies tumble. The whole huddled mass of humanity rises, groaning, and is turned back out onto the cold street to begin the business of surviving another day. There is no breakfast provided, no farewell, no thanks for your custom. There is only the door, and beyond it, the city already stirring. You stand, you stretch, and every joint in your body files a complaint. Before anything else, before food, before work, before a single other thought, there is a far more urgent matter to attend to. And in Georgian England, that particular matter is not remotely private. Nature is calling, and in this century, answering that call is a communal event whether you like it or not. There is no bathroom waiting for you. There is no plumbing, and certainly nothing that could be described as flushing. In the corner of last night's lodging house sits a chamber pot, already well used by the household, and your only contribution to make is to add to it and then, later, deal with the consequences. Dealing with the consequences usually means hauling it to a window and tipping the contents into the street below, ideally with a shouted warning first, though passers-by rarely move quite fast enough to avoid it entirely. The streets themselves are the great open drain of Georgian England. Every gutter carries its own quiet river of waste, and it is genuinely everywhere you look, once you start looking. In the homes of the wealthy, there might be a proper privy, a small wooden closet built over a deep pit, offering the rare luxuries of both a seat and a door that closes. For everyone else, the options are the pot, the yard, or a shared outhouse serving so many households that the morning queue would put a modern coffee shop to shame. These pits fill steadily, and when they overflow, which happens more often than anyone would like, the contents seep quietly into gardens, cellars, and the very groundwater that people are still drinking from. Picture drawing your morning water from a well that sits just downhill from where your neighbor's cesspit has been leaking for months. That isn't an unusual horror story. That is simply Tuesday. Rain does not clean the streets so much as stir them, sending a thick tide of mud, animal droppings, kitchen scraps, and emptied chamber pots sliding along in the gutters. In some neighborhoods, pigs are allowed to roam freely as a kind of unofficial cleanup crew, eating whatever scraps they find, a solution that solves one problem while creating several new and stranger ones. To cross a Georgian street in your good clothes is to risk ruining them entirely, which is exactly why the wealthy pay small boys known as crossing sweepers to clear a path ahead of them for a coin. It's less a tip and more a toll, charged for the privilege of not stepping in something unspeakable. Then there is the smell, which truly deserves its own moment of consideration, because it earns it. It rises from the gutters, drifts from the overflowing pits, and settles over the entire city like an invisible fog thick enough to taste. On a hot summer afternoon, it is genuinely staggering, strong enough to turn even a hardened stomach, and most people of the time sincerely believe that this foul air itself is what spreads disease. They are wrong about the precise mechanism, but not entirely wrong that something in all of this filth is making the city sick. You learn, as everyone learns, to breathe shallow and complain rarely. Spare a thought as you pick your way through it all, for the night soil men, the people whose entire trade is climbing down into the cesspits after dark, by candlelight, and hauling the waste out bucket by bucket to be sold as fertilizer outside the city walls. It is dangerous, filthy, occasionally fatal work, and it is done by men who are paid astonishingly little for it. You watch one trudge past with his reeking cart at the end of a long night's labor, and your own morning suddenly feels a little less unbearable by comparison. Having survived the walk without stepping in anything catastrophic, you find your nerves in need of settling. And in this century, there is really only one accepted method for settling your nerves before the sun is even properly up. It is early morning, your head aches from a poor night's sleep, and the obvious solution in Georgian England is to start drinking. Not tea, gin. This is the height of what history remembers as the gin craze, and cheap spirits flow through the poorer quarters of London like a flammable tide. Gin is consumed by nearly everyone, at nearly every hour, for nearly every reason imaginable. It is cheaper than beer. It is cheaper, often, than bread. And it is a great deal warmer than the lodging house you've just been turned out of. Shops sell it by the cupful, some advertising with cheerful bluntness that a customer can be drunk for a penny and thoroughly drunk for two, with clean straw thrown in free of charge to lie down on afterward. It dulls the hunger, softens the cold, and quiets the nagging awareness of just how difficult your circumstances are. It will, in time, also help destroy you. But that is a problem for a later, blurrier version of yourself to deal with. To understand how an entire city came to drink like this, you have to understand the economics of misery. Gin is cheap to distill and cheaper still to sell, lightly taxed and producible almost anywhere with a still and very little concern for quality. For a poor Londoner crammed into one cold, hungry room, a cup of gin is simply the most affordable form of comfort within reach. It manages in a single swallow what a proper meal, a warm fire, and a day of rest cannot, because none of those things are actually available to you. So you drink, and your neighbor drinks, and the family 2 doors down drinks, and slowly an entire quarter of the city settles into a kind of cheerful, communal, self-inflicted haze. Gin shops are tucked into cellars, doorways, and the fronts of buildings that look respectable and are nothing of the sort. Some amount to little more than a plank laid across 2 barrels and a line of customers. The quality, predictably, is dreadful, often cut with turpentine, sulfuric acid, or whatever else happens to make it burn hotter and stretch the batch further. It scours your throat on the way down and leaves a headache behind that could knock over a horse. And yet you go back for more, because the alternative is facing this particular day stone sober, and nobody in their right mind wants to do that. The consequences ripple out across the whole city, visible on every corner. Families spend their last coins on gin instead of bread. Laborers stumble to work unsteady on their feet when they show up at all. Children go unwatched, accidents pile up, and entire neighborhoods sink into a permanent, glassy-eyed haze that visiting writers describe with real alarm. Reformers wring their hands. Artists sketch grim little scenes of ruin and despair. Eventually, the authorities panic enough to pass laws taxing and restricting the trade, and slowly, over decades, it works. But for now, this morning, you are standing squarely in the middle of the flood, cup in hand. What is perhaps most striking, seen from the safety of your own century, is how utterly unremarkable it all feels from the inside. Nobody in this crowd thinks of their morning cup as strange, any more than you might think twice about your own morning coffee. It is simply what one does. It is medicine, breakfast, and the closest thing to comfort available, all in one small glass. To make it through a Georgian morning without it would strike your neighbors as odd, a little sad, even. So you drink your pennyworth, feel the warmth spread through your chest, and decide that the day ahead looks marginally less grim than it did 5 minutes ago. And now, feeling almost presentable, it's time to think about actually looking the part. Because if fashion is on your mind today, you are about to make some genuinely alarming choices with your own face. If you're hopping to look anything like the fashionable people strolling through the better streets of town, you're about to make some genuinely alarming choices with your own face. The height of Georgian beauty is skin so pale it borders on lifeless, and the most popular way to achieve that look is a face paint built on a foundation of white lead. You smear it on in thick, careful layers, hiding smallpox scars, blemishes, and the ordinary wear of simply staying alive in this century. The trouble is that the lead itself eats gradually into the skin beneath it, so more must be applied to cover the new damage, which causes further damage in turn. A slow, looping trap that can leave fashionable women looking gray, sickly, and in the worst cases, dead. To understand why anyone would choose this, you first have to understand what pale skin actually signals. An untouched, milky complexion tells the world that you do not labor outdoors. that you are wealthy enough to remain indoors and idle while others burn under the sun in the fields and streets. Pale skin isn't simply considered pretty. It is a walking advertisement that you have never done a day of honest physical work in your life. In a society obsessed with rank, that message is worth almost any price, including, as it turns out, your own health. The paint itself is a paste of white lead blended with vinegar into a smooth, deathly finish, brushed over the whole face and down onto the neck. Rouge follows for the cheeks and lips, frequently colored with equally toxic compounds, and perhaps a small silk beauty patch or two, cut into a fashionable shape and stuck on to disguise a blemish or hint playfully at flirtation. In candlelight, the finished effect is smooth, pale, and genuinely striking. The trouble, again, is entirely what's happening underneath. Lead is a poison the body was never built to tolerate, and worn day after day it slowly seeps in, damaging both the skin it was meant to beautify and the body carrying it. So the trap closes. The lead ruins the complexion, so more lead is applied to hide the ruin. Skin grays and roughens. Hair thins. Teeth loosen in their sockets. A strange, creeping heaviness settles into the limbs. Rather than stop, which would mean letting the damage show, the fashionables simply add another layer, painting over the evidence with a hand mirror and a steady, poisoned supply. The cruelest part is that most victims have no real idea what is slowly killing them. They know only that they must never, under any circumstance, be seen without the paint in place. History remembers a handful of celebrated beauties who effectively painted themselves into early graves, their deaths whispered about in fashionable drawing rooms even as other women reached for the exact same pots. The warnings do little to slow the trend, because the pressure to fit in is simply stronger than fear of a harm that feels distant and abstract. When the choice comes down to looking right today versus feeling unwell at some point later, later loses nearly every time. A lesson, if we're honest, that later centuries haven't entirely learned either. By the time you finish, your face is a smooth, pale mask of chemical elegance, and you feel, all things considered, rather grand. But a fashionable face is only step one. No respectable Georgian would dream of appearing in public with their own natural hair on display, and what you need next, tall, white, and faintly alive with unwelcome tenants, is a truly magnificent wig. On top of your newly poisoned face goes the real crown jewel of Georgian fashion, an enormous, towering, powdered wig. The taller and whiter the better, and that whiteness comes from flour and starch dusted on in such quantity that a fitting room can end up looking like the inside of a small indoor snowstorm. These wigs are expensive, elaborately built, and almost never washed, which makes them an ideal, cozy home for lice, fleas, and the occasional disoriented moth. Fashionable ladies carry long, thin scratching sticks specifically designed to relieve an itch deep inside the structure without disturbing the sculpture balanced on top of their heads. You itch, you scratch discreetly, you reapply the powder, and you remind yourself that in this world, looking clean matters a great deal more than actually being clean. A fine wig is not a disguise so much as a statement. The best are made from real human hair, frequently sold by poor women desperate for a handful of coins, then curled, styled, and mounted into shapes that seem to defy both gravity and common sense. The grandest examples rise so high they need a wire frame and padding beneath, decorated with ribbons, feathers, and in the most extravagant cases, small ornaments arranged across the top like a tiny still life painting. Wearing one is, frankly, a feat of endurance, heavy, hot, and precariously balanced, and turning your head too quickly can send the whole magnificent structure listing sideways like a ship caught in a sudden storm. Then comes the powdering itself, which is where the whole enterprise tips fully into the absurd. To achieve that fashionable snow-white finish, the wig is dusted liberally with fine powder made largely from flour, applied so generously that grand households keep entire closets set aside purely for the messy business. You stand there, holding your breath, while a cloud of it settles over your head, your shoulders, and everything within arm's reach. That flour, worth noting, is the same flower that could otherwise have fed a hungry family. An awkward detail that becomes considerably harder to ignore during years when bread itself is scarce, and crowds start noticing exactly how much of it is sitting, unused, on aristocratic heads. Now about those unwelcome tenants. Because these wigs go days or weeks without any real cleaning, and because the scalp underneath is rarely much cleaner, they quietly become small, thriving ecosystems of their own. Lice and fleas move in and settle down comfortably in the warm, powdery dark. It's such a common and accepted problem that the elegant solution isn't to wash the thing, but to scratch discreetly with an ornamental stick, so that a lady might relieve an itch mid-conversation without disturbing her hairstyle or, heaven forbid, admitting anything is wrong at all. It is politeness and infestation walking arm in arm. The whole enterprise, predictably, does not smell especially good. Between unwashed natural hair, stale powder, the sweat of carrying a heavy structure through a long day, and the small livestock in residence, a fashionable head is not a particularly fragrant place to be. The answer, naturally, is more perfume, more powder, and a firm, unspoken social agreement that nobody will ever mention it. Everyone is in the same faintly ripe boat together, so nobody rocks it. To smell of powder and paste is simply to smell like a person of quality, and a person of quality does not go around investigating too closely what lies just beneath the surface. And yet you wear it proudly, because to go without would be genuinely unthinkable, rather like showing up to a grand occasion half-dressed. The wig is armor, status, and identity, all bundled together into one itchy, teetering monument balanced on your head. You adjust it carefully, brush off the worst of the fallen powder, and feel every bit the fashionable creature you're pretending to be. Which leaves only one task before you can properly face the world. Because you are hungry, and it's time for breakfast, though whether what you're about to eat truly qualifies as food is a matter of some genuine debate. Your bread, that great staple of the Georgian table, has almost certainly been tampered with in one way or another. Bakers and sellers regularly stretch their flour with cheaper, whiter fillers, chalk, ground bone, or alum, a chemical that whitens the loaf and makes a cheap batch look purer and pricier than it actually is. Your beer may well be watered down and doctored. Your milk has been carried across filthy streets in open pails, gathering whatever the air happens to donate along the way. Your tea leaves have quite possibly already been used once, dried out, and sold again as fresh. You chew, you swallow, and you try very hard not to think too closely about what any of it actually contains. In Georgian England, every single meal is a small act of blind trust. Let's start with the bread, because bread is nearly everything here, the foundation of the poor diet, the thing that fills a belly when nothing else will. And precisely because everyone needs it so badly, everyone is tempted to cheat where they can. White bread is prized as finer and more respectable than dark, so unscrupulous bakers whiten cheap flour with alum, which fools the eye, hardens the loaf, and quietly plays havoc with the digestion. Others bulk out the dough with ground chalk or powdered bone, stretching a small amount of real flour into a much larger, more profitable batch. The result looks like bread, feels like bread in the hand, and technically keeps you alive. But it is a long way from anything you'd want to build real strength on. The milk is its own small horror. It arrives in the city from tired, poorly kept cows, is frequently watered down to stretch the volume, then whitened back up again with chalk or other additives to disguise the dilution. By the time it reaches your cup, it has traveled through dirty streets in open containers, collecting dust, grime, and whatever else the air cares to contribute. On a warm day it turns sour quickly, so a little something is sometimes added to mask that too. You drink it because it is what there is, and because dwelling too long on its journey before noon is simply not something you can afford to do. Even life's small comforts are corrupted. Tea, that beloved daily ritual, is expensive, so used leaves are dried out, dyed, and sold a second time, occasionally bulked out with the leaves of an entirely different plant dressed up to look the part. Beer is watered and adjusted with bitter additives to disguise its weakness. Sweets and pickles are brightened with coloring agents that are, frankly, alarming, some containing metals that no one should be anywhere near, let alone eating. There is no inspector to stop any of this, no label to warn you, and no simple way to tell an honest loaf from a dishonest one. You simply eat, hope for the best, and get on with your day. What makes it all so unsettling in hindsight is how ordinary it is. Nobody is being singled out for a cruel trick. This is simply the standard condition of nearly every meal, for nearly everyone, rich and poor alike, cheated in their own different ways from the very same impulse to stretch a profit as far as it will possibly go. Trust in your food, something your own century takes almost entirely for granted, simply does not exist here. Every bite is a small, quiet gamble. You finish your questionable bread and your suspicious milk, feeling neither nourished nor poisoned, which, in this century, counts as a genuine win. Around you the city is fully awake now, its workshops opening, its streets filling, and among that bustle, the smallest workers of the day are already climbing toward a job so grim it's worth pausing the humor entirely. Now let's talk about the children, because their story deserves to be told plainly, without the usual jokes. In Georgian towns, chimneys are narrow and twisting, and the cheapest way to clean one is to send a small child climbing up inside it with a brush. These climbing boys, some as young as 5 or 6, are chosen precisely because they're small enough to fit where no adult ever could. They climb in total darkness, scraping their knees and elbows raw, breathing in soot that will damage their lungs for the rest of their lives, however long that turns out to be. There is nothing funny here, only the quiet, uncomfortable truth that a great many comforts of this era were quietly built on the suffering of the very young. These children are almost always desperately poor orphans, most often, or the sons of families so hard up that a master sweep will take a boy on as an apprentice in exchange for food, a rough sort of shelter, and the vague promise of a trade someday. In practice, that arrangement usually means long hours, harsh treatment, and labor no adult would ever be asked to perform. The boy belongs more or less to the master, who is under very little real obligation to treat him gently. Some masters are kind, many are not. The boy has no real say in the matter and nowhere else to go. The work itself is brutal in every detail. A chimney flue might be no wider than the span of a small child's body, twisting and narrowing as it rises through a house that is often still warm, sometimes still hot from a recent fire. The boy climbs by bracing his back against one side and his knees against the other, inching upward through the choking dark one painful push at a time. Soot coats his skin, fills his eyes, and settles deep into his lungs. Over time, his knees and elbows harden into thick calluses, a process some masters cruelly hurry along on purpose. It is a childhood spent inside the walls, unseen and unheard by the very families whose comfort depends on him. The dangers never let up. A boy can become wedged tight in a narrow flue, unable to move up or down, and in the worst cases cannot be freed before it's too late. He can lose his grip and fall the full height of a house. He can be badly burned if a chimney is lit too soon, or overcome entirely by smoke and fumes. And beyond the sudden, dramatic accidents lies a slower, quieter harm, the lasting damage done to young lungs and growing bodies by years spent breathing soot in the dark. Many climbing boys do not live especially long lives, and those who survive often carry the marks of the work for the rest of their days. What makes this particular horror so hard to sit with is simply how accepted it is. The comfort of a clean, well-drawing fireplace in a warm parlor rests directly on the labor of a frightened child somewhere up in the flue above. The family gathered by the hearth never has to see him, never has to think of him, and mostly doesn't. He is simply part of the machinery of a comfortable home, about as remarkable as the coal in the scuttle. Only later, as reformers begin to speak up and lawmakers slowly and reluctantly act, does the practice come under real challenge. And even then it takes decades and several rounds of legislation before it's finally brought to an end. It's worth remembering these children precisely because they are so easily forgotten. They left few records and even fewer choices, and the warmth they helped provide was enjoyed by people who rarely learned their names. As you stand in the busy street and watch a small, soot-blackened figure trudge along behind his master toward the next house, it's a sobering reminder of exactly who paid the hidden price for Georgian comfort. And speaking of prices paid in health and suffering, if you happen to fall ill in this century, the person you turn to for help may end up doing you more harm than the illness ever would have. You're feeling unwell, so naturally you go looking for a physician, which, in Georgian England, is a bit like asking someone who starts fires to come and inspect your chimney. The leading medical theory of the age still holds that illness comes from an imbalance somewhere within the body, and the favored remedy is, more often than not, to remove some of you. Usually that means opening a vein and draining a good quantity of your blood into a bowl until you feel appropriately lightheaded and supposedly cured. If bleeding doesn't do the trick, there is purging, blistering, and a whole cheerful menu of substances designed purely to make you vomit. You arrive sick and weak. You leave sicker and weaker still, but at least you've been thoroughly and expensively treated. The whole system rests on an old idea that the body is governed by 4 internal fluids, or humors, and that good health is simply a matter of keeping them in proper balance. When illness strikes, the reasoning goes, one of these fluids must be sitting in excess, and the obvious solution is to remove the surplus by whatever means are available. It sounds almost tidy, right up until you realize that every available method is deeply unpleasant, and none of them actually work. There is no concept of germs in this picture, no real understanding of infection, just a confident, elegant-sounding theory that happens to be entirely wrong, and enthusiastically applied anyway. Bleeding is the great favorite, reached for early and often. The physician opens a vein, usually in the arm, and lets the blood run freely into a basin, judging by eye and tradition alone how much to take. For stubborn cases, leeches are applied instead, small and patient, drawing the blood out slowly, drop by drop. The theory insists this restores balance. The reality is that it simply weakens an already struggling patient, and for someone genuinely ill, losing a substantial amount of blood is close to the last thing their body actually needs. And yet the patient often does feel calmer afterward, faint, drowsy, and easily mistaking that dazed relief for the first sign of recovery. If bleeding alone isn't judged sufficient, the physician reaches for the rest of his arsenal. Purges empty the bowels. Emetics force vomiting. Blistering agents raise painful sores directly on the skin, all in the firm belief that driving the sickness out through some exit or another must surely help. Mercury is prescribed with startling freedom, a heavy metal that poisons every bit as much as it treats, causing drooling, loosened teeth, and worse the longer it's used. The medicines are harsh. The underlying logic is entirely circular, and the poor patient is subjected to the whole lot, growing steadily more miserable with each expensive intervention. Getting well in the end is largely a matter of surviving the treatment, and it does not come cheap, which adds real insult to genuine injury. A proper physician charges proper fees, and for that money you receive a confident diagnosis, a few learned Latin phrases, and a course of treatment that leaves you noticeably worse off than when you arrived. The wealthy can afford to be bled, purged, and dosed into a stupor by the very finest men in the profession. The poor make do with cheaper practitioners, folk remedies passed down through the family, or simply riding the illness out at home, which, given the alternatives, is frequently the wiser choice by far. Recovery, when it does come, is always credited entirely to the treatment, never to the body's own stubborn resilience. If you live, the physician is a genius. If you die, well, the illness was simply too strong for even his skill to overcome. Either way, his reputation survives fully intact, ready for the next trembling patient through the door. You stagger out of your own consultation, pale, drained, and several coins poorer, genuinely unsure whether you feel better or merely emptier. And as you run your tongue over your aching teeth, you remember that there is one part of the body where Georgian medical care somehow manages to be even more alarming than everywhere else. Open wide, because Georgian dentistry is a horror entirely its own. Sugar has arrived in Britain in enormous new quantities, and the wealthy in particular are rotting their teeth at an astonishing rate. When those teeth finally fail, the fashionable solution isn't a gentle false set carved from wood or bone. It's a real, living tooth, pulled straight from someone else's mouth and pressed into yours. The donors are the poor, who sell their own healthy teeth for a handful of coins because they need the money considerably more than they need a full smile. The transplants rarely take root properly. They often introduce disease, and they almost always fail eventually. But for one brief, glittering moment, a rich smile can be borrowed straight from the mouth of someone desperate. The root of the problem, so to speak, is sugar. Once a rare and precious luxury, it now pours into the country in vast quantities, sweetening the tea, the cakes, and the puddings of anyone who can afford it, and the richer you are, the more sugar you consume. So, in a strange twist, rotten teeth become a peculiar mark of wealth. The poor, who can't afford such treats, often keep their teeth in noticeably better condition, which is exactly why their mouths become such a valuable resource for their so-called betters. There's a real, bitter irony in a fashion that quite literally rots the mouths of the rich, then repairs itself using the teeth of the poor. When decay finally sets in, and it always does, the pain is enormous. There is no gentle drilling and filling to be had here. The standard treatment for a bad tooth is simply to pull it, and the pulling is done without anything worth calling pain relief. A tooth drawer grips the offending tooth with an iron instrument and wrenches, twisting and levering until it finally comes free, along with a good deal of screaming. The work is often carried out by barbers, blacksmiths, or traveling showmen who set up shop in the market square and pull teeth for a paying, wincing crowd. Precision is never really the goal. Speed is. The tooth transplant trade grows directly out of this misery. A wealthy patient who has lost a front tooth doesn't want an unsightly gap on display at dinner, so a surgeon offers a startling remedy. A healthy tooth is pulled from the mouth of a poor donor, someone hungry enough to sell it, and pressed immediately into the fresh socket of the paying customer, then bound in place in the hope that it will take root. Sometimes, briefly, it seems to. More often it loosens, blackens, and fails outright. Worse still, it can carry infection directly from one mouth into another, spreading disease through the very treatment meant to beautify. For the donors, it is a grim bargain born entirely of need. Selling a tooth means selling a piece of your own body for the price of a meal or two, enduring the exact same brutal extraction as anyone with a decayed tooth, only this time from a perfectly healthy, perfectly painful mouth. The buyers rarely spare a thought for where their new tooth came from, and the sellers rarely have the luxury of refusing the offer. It's a small, quiet trade in human parts, conducted comfortably in the shadow of grand houses and elegant drawing rooms, and it captures something quietly true about the whole age. That comfort at the top so often rested directly on sacrifice at the bottom. In time, better false teeth come along, sets carved from bone, ivory, or more grimly, teeth gathered from battlefield dead. An improvement of sorts, though a macabre one. But for now, the fashionable smile is a fragile, borrowed thing, aching and impermanent, held together by hope and a length of binding thread. You close your mouth carefully around your own troublesome teeth and count yourself lucky, at least for today, to still have them. Whatever ails you in Georgian England, there is really one universal remedy, sold openly and cheaply as a tincture called laudanum. It is opium dissolved in wine or water, dripped in for pain, for coughs, for frayed nerves, for sadness, for boredom, for simply getting through an ordinary day. Nobody views it as dangerous. It is viewed instead as sensible, practical even. Most troubling of all, exhausted mothers and overwhelmed caregivers give opium-laced syrups directly to infants to keep them quiet and sleeping, with no real idea of the harm being done. The bottles promise calm and comfort, and for a while, they genuinely deliver both, right up until the moment they deliver something far darker instead. Laudanum is everywhere and available to absolutely everyone. There is no prescription required, no warning printed on the label, no real restriction at all on who may buy it or how much. It sits on apothecary shelves and general store counters right alongside the ordinary household goods, cheap enough that even the poor can manage a dose, reached for as casually as you might reach for a mild home remedy today. A person in pain takes it, and the pain genuinely fades. A person who cannot sleep takes it, and sleep genuinely comes. A person weighed down by hardship takes it, and for a little while the weight genuinely lifts. Its usefulness is entirely real, which is exactly what makes the whole situation so difficult to see clearly from the inside. The trouble is that opium doesn't only soothe. Taken often enough, it takes hold, and the body comes to need it, so that stopping brings its own fresh suffering. People who begin using it for a genuine complaint often find themselves unable to do without it, taking larger and larger doses to reach the same relief, until the remedy has quietly become the master rather than the servant. This happens across every level of society, from the poor laborer to the respectable lady of the house. And because the drug is so ordinary, so thoroughly accepted, the slow slide into dependence often goes entirely unremarked, mistaken for simple weakness or nerves, rather than recognized for what it truly is. The hardest part to speak of is what happens to the very youngest. Overworked mothers, many laboring long hours with no one to mind their children, turn to soothing syrups sold specifically to quiet, fretful infants. These medicines, marketed as gentle and perfectly safe, contain opium, and they work by simply dulling the child into sleep. For a desperate, exhausted parent with no other real help available, a quiet baby can feel like nothing short of salvation. But an infant is fragile, and a dose that calms can very easily become a dose that harms. Children sicken, waste away, and are lost to these syrups in numbers that would be unthinkable if anyone had truly understood what the bottle contained. And that really is the crux of the whole matter. Almost no one understands. The dangers of opium, its grip, its cost, are not yet properly known, and the medicines are trusted precisely because they are sold so openly, used so widely by everyone. A mother reaching for a soothing syrup isn't being careless. She's doing exactly what her neighbors do, what her own mother did before her, what the shopkeeper and the advertisement both assure her is perfectly safe. The harm is real, the intentions are not remotely cruel, and that gap between the two is what makes this particular corner of the age so genuinely sorrowful to look back on. Only much later would the true cost finally be counted, the dependence, the deaths, the quiet damage done in countless homes by a remedy nobody had thought to fear. If real medicine will bleed you dry, and opium will simply send you off to sleep, there is always the colorful world of the quack doctor to consider. Georgian England is bursting with self-declared healers selling miracle tonics, magnetic devices, mild electrical shocks, and pills that claim to cure everything from baldness to a broken heart. They advertise loudly in the newspapers with glowing testimonials, nearly all of them entirely invented, and they stage dazzling little shows to draw a crowd. Some sell plain bottled water as a cure for gout. Others promise to restore youth, vigor, and romance with a single spoonful of something suspiciously brown. It will cost you your savings and cure you of absolutely nothing. But the salesman, at the very least, does have a genuinely excellent hat. The quack thrives precisely because real medicine is so terrible. When the honest physician offers you bleeding, purging, and a bill you can barely afford, the smiling stranger with a colorful bottle suddenly starts to look rather appealing by comparison. He doesn't threaten to drain you into a bowl. He promises health, happiness, and a full head of hair, all for a modest sum and a small leap of faith. In a century desperate for relief and starved of real answers, that promise sells itself very easily, and the quacks know it perfectly well. They aren't doctors. They are showmen who simply happen to specialize in symptoms. Their remedies are gloriously, dangerously inventive. There are pills said to contain secret ingredients gathered from distant, exotic lands, tonics that are mostly gin with a splash of coloring added, powders supposedly capable of curing fevers, aches, and a broken heart all in one go. There are strange devices too, metal rods and handheld tractors, claimed to draw disease out of the body through some mysterious unseen force, and machines that deliver a mild electrical tingle, sold as the very latest word in scientific healing. None of it does what it claims. Some of it does nothing at all, which, given the alternatives on offer, is arguably the safest possible outcome for the customer. The real genius lies entirely in the marketing, and here the quacks are genuinely ahead of their time. They flood the newspapers with advertisements crammed full of testimonials from grateful customers, nearly all of whom exist nowhere but on the page. They give their potions grand and impressive names, and hint at royal endorsements they've never actually received. They stage public demonstrations, curring planted actors of imaginary ailments in front of an amazed crowd, then selling their wares briskly while the excitement is still running high. It is theater dressed up convincingly as medicine, and it works beautifully, because people want so badly to believe that somewhere out there is a single bottle that will finally, truly make things better. Of course, the whole business runs entirely unregulated, which means anyone with sufficient confidence and a good supply of empty bottles can simply set up shop as a healer. There is no license to earn, no standard to meet, and nobody around to stop a determined charlatan from selling colored water to the dying. Some quacks grow genuinely rich this way, building solid fortunes and lasting reputations on the hopes of the sick. A handful of their remedies even become household names, trusted for generations, despite doing essentially nothing except part fools from their money. The line between honest medicine and outright fraud isn't so much blurred here as cheerfully, openly ignored. The tragedy hiding underneath the comedy is that the desperate lose the most. A poor family spending its very last coins on a miracle tonic for a dying relative gets no miracle in return, only an emptier purse and exactly the same grief they started with. But you can hardly blame them for trying, not when the trained physician down the street offers nothing but leeches and confident Latin phrases. So you watch the showman work his crowd, quietly admire the sheer audacity of the whole performance, and keep a firm hand on your own purse as you move along. Among fashionable families, feeding your own baby is considered rather beneath a lady of quality, so the task is handed instead to a wet nurse, a woman paid to nurse and raise an infant in her own home, often far out in the countryside. For the wealthy mother, this arrangement means freedom and continued standing in society. For the baby, it means being sent away from home in its very first weeks of life, into a household of complete strangers, with survival far from guaranteed. Some nurses are loving and attentive. Others take on more infants than they could ever properly manage. It's a quiet, everyday arrangement spoken of as perfectly ordinary that carries a weight rarely paused over to measure. The reasoning behind it says a great deal about the age. A fashionable lady is expected to return quickly to society after giving birth, to her dinners, her dances, her endless round of social visits, and the demands of feeding an infant simply don't fit neatly into that life. There's a belief, too, that nursing is coarse, physical work unsuited to a woman of true refinement, and so the newborn is handed off to a hired woman, and the mother returns promptly to her drawing room. The whole exchange is treated as sensible household management, rather than anything worth grieving over. The wet nurse herself is usually a working woman who has recently had a child of her own, and who can earn much-needed money by nursing another alongside it. In the better arrangements, she takes the infant into her own cottage, feeds and tends it with genuine care, and effectively raises it as her own for a year or two before finally returning it to a family it has never really known. A kind nurse can give a child real warmth and attention that its own birth mother, caught up in the demands of society, might never have offered. When the match is a good one, The whole system works, and the child thrives in humble surroundings, far removed from the grand house it was actually born into. But the system carries a darker edge too, one that shows itself most clearly wherever money and desperation meet. Some nurses, poor themselves and eager for the income, take on more infants than any one woman could realistically feed and properly tend. The bobbies compete for too little milk and far too little attention, and in crowded, struggling households, the youngest and weakest don't always survive. Distance only makes matters worse. A mother tucked safely away in the city cannot see how her child is actually faring. She cannot check the living conditions. She has no real way of knowing whether the reassuring letters she receives match the reality on the ground. She simply trusts, and sometimes that trust is badly misplaced. What makes it all so sobering isn't cruelty, exactly, but sheer casualness. Sending a newborn away to be raised by a stranger isn't seen as a hard or painful choice in this world. It is simply what is done, about as ordinary as hearing a cook or a housemaid. The emotional cost to a child separated from its family in its earliest, most fragile days is scarcely considered, because the age simply doesn't yet think in those terms. The deep bond between mother and infant that your own century treats as something precious is here, quietly, almost casually, outsourced, its risks accepted as simply the natural order of things. Not every story ends in sorrow, of course, and many children come home perfectly healthy, to families genuinely glad to have them back. But the whole arrangement rests on a fragile hope that a paid stranger, far away and largely unwatched, will care for someone else's baby as faithfully as she would her own. And hope, it turns out, is a rather thin thing to build an infant's early life upon. In the heart of London stands a hospital built specifically for the bobbies nobody else could keep, children of mothers too poor, too desperate, or too deeply shamed to raise them. Bringing an infant here isn't an act of cruelty. It's an act of pure heartbreak, a last hope that the child might live a life the mother simply cannot provide. Each baby is left behind with a small personal token, a coin, a scrap of ribbon, a torn piece of fabric, so that one day, should fortune ever allow it, the mother might return and reclaim her child by matching the item. Most never do come back. The tokens remain behind in a drawer, a quiet collection of tiny, silent goodbyes, each one its own small tragedy. The hospital exists because the alternative is so very much worse. Before its doors opened, infants born to mothers with no means and no husband had almost nowhere at all to turn, and far too many were simply abandoned in the streets, left out in the cold amid the general indifference of a hard, unforgiving city. A charitable founder, moved deeply by the sight of dying infants in the gutters, spent years campaigning to build a place that would take them in, feed them, and give them at least some real chance at survival. It's a genuine act of mercy in an age not exactly overburdened with them. A rare institution built not to punish the poor, but to catch the smallest and most vulnerable of them before they fall through the cracks entirely. Still, the need far outstrips the available space, and admission itself becomes its own painful ordeal. There are always more bobbies than the hospital could possibly take in, and mothers arrive in numbers heartbreaking enough on their own, each one hoping desperately that her child will be among the fortunate few chosen. For a time, places are decided purely by lottery, a mother drawing a colored ball from a bag to learn whether her baby will be admitted, turned away, or held in uncertain reserve. Imagine standing there, your infant in your arms, your entire future decided by nothing more than the color of a ball drawn blind from a sack. It's a cruel necessity born of a shortage of resources, not a lack of genuine kindness. The tokens are the detail that lingers longest in the mind. A mother giving up her baby is asked to leave behind some small identifying object, so that if her circumstances ever change, she might one day return and prove the child is truly hers. And so she leaves what little she has, a single coin, sometimes deliberately bent or inscribed, a scrap of ribbon or printed fabric torn from her own clothing, a button, a bead, a folded scrap of paper bearing a few words. These humble objects are carefully recorded and kept, each one attached forever to a particular child, each one representing a mother who could not stay, but simply could not bear to leave with nothing at all behind her. They remain among the most quietly moving objects the whole century produced. For most, the return simply never comes. Life for the poor is precarious and unforgiving in the extreme, and the change in fortune that might allow a mother to reclaim her child rarely, if ever, arrives. The children grow up inside the institution itself, given a new name, a basic education, and eventually a trade, cared for far better than the streets would ever have managed, but permanently without the family they were actually born into. Some go on to build steady, decent lives of their own. Others do not. And in the hospital's own records, besides so many names, sits a token that was never redeemed, a small object meant to reunite a family, becoming instead the only trace either one ever left of the other. On a free afternoon, some Georgians go looking for entertainment, and one genuinely popular destination is a hospital for the mentally ill, known to nearly everyone by its familiar nickname Bedlam. For a small entrance fee, visitors are let in to wander the wards freely, to look at the patients, to point, to laugh, and to treat human suffering as though it were a kind of theater. It's considered a perfectly ordinary outing, no stranger, really, than visiting a menagerie of exotic animals. There is nothing amusing in it now, and there was, in truth, nothing amusing in it then either, only vulnerable people put on display for the entertainment of the comfortable. It stands as a real reminder of how easily an age can remain blind to its own cruelty. The building itself is grand and imposing, its impressive front designed deliberately to impress passers-by, its true purpose to house those the age simply has no other idea what to do with. Understanding of mental illness is nearly non-existent at this point in history. There are no real treatments to speak of, no compassionate framework at all, only confinement, physical restraint, and a set of harsh, badly mistaken theories about what actually ails the people held inside. The patients are among the most defenseless human beings in the whole of Georgian society, unwell, often frightened, and entirely at the mercy of their keepers. And it is precisely these people that the paying public comes to see. The practice grows out of a mix of curiosity, ignorance, and a genuine belief that the sights within might serve as entertainment, or even as a kind of moral instruction. Visitors stroll the corridors as though touring an attraction, peering into cells, commenting freely on the patient's behavior, sometimes even provoking a reaction for their own amusement. A few visitors do come with real concern, perhaps to see a relative, or to offer some small charity. But many come simply to gawk, to be shocked or entertained, treating the genuine distress of the sick as a show laid on for their idle afternoon. That an entire society saw nothing especially wrong in this is itself part of the horror. For the patients, there is no dignity in any of it. Being unwell is hard enough on its own. Being unwell, confined, and then put on display for strangers who stare and mock is a cruelty stacked directly on top of another cruelty. They have no privacy, no say in the matter, and no escape at all from the eyes of the crowd. Conditions inside are grim by almost any measure, the care crude, the understanding absent entirely, and the constant traffic of curious onlookers only deepens the indignity of it all. These are human beings reduced, quite literally, to curiosities, their worst moments turned into a spectacle for people who will go home afterward to a warm supper and think no more of it. In time, attitudes do begin to shift. Reformers grow uneasy, then genuinely appalled, and the notion of letting the public simply wander in and view the patients comes to be seen, finally, for the cruelty it truly is. The open visiting is eventually stopped, and slowly, over many decades, ideas about how the mentally ill deserve to be treated begin to change, though real reform proves a long and halting road. That it took this long to recognize such an obvious wrong is a sobering thought, a caution, really, against assuming that any age, including our own, sees all of its own cruelties clearly. Yet the Georgian appetite for spectacle does not end at the hospital gates. There is another crowd gathering elsewhere in the city today, drawn by an event even grimmer and even more widely popular. Some mornings, the whole city seems to empty out toward a single spot, because today there is a hanging, and a hanging is an event. Crowds line the entire route. Vendors sell food and printed ballads about the condemned prisoner, and families bring their children along to secure a good view. The procession from the prison to the gallows can take hours, the crowd along the way cheering, jeering, or occasionally weeping, depending entirely on the prisoner's public reputation. To modern eyes it looks grotesque, a death turned deliberately into a festival. To Georgian eyes, it is simply justice, warning, and free entertainment, all rolled neatly into one long, grim afternoon out. The day itself follows a rhythm everyone in the city already knows by heart. The condemned are brought out from the prison and loaded onto a cart for the long, slow journey through the streets toward the gallows. The route is lined with spectators, thousands upon thousands of them, packed into windows, perched precariously on walls, jostling hard for a good position along the way. It's treated as something close to a public holiday, a welcome break from ordinary labor. Apprentices are given the morning off. Taverns do a roaring trade. The whole city turns out to watch a handful of people die, and does so with an appetite that is honestly difficult to fully comprehend from a gentler age. The condemned themselves become the stars of this terrible show, and the crowd's mood toward each one varies wildly depending on who they are. A notorious robber with a dashing public reputation might be cheered like a folk hero, showered with flowers, urged loudly to make a bold final speech. A killer of the helpless, by contrast, might be pelted and cursed at every step of the journey. The prisoners themselves know this well, and many play deliberately to the crowd, dressing in their very finest clothes, riding toward their own deaths with a kind of defiant swagger, determined to make what's called a good end before the assembled multitude. A brave performance on the cart could even win a strange kind of grim immortality in the printed ballads sold immediately afterward. And the ballads truly are everywhere. Enterprising printers churn out cheap sheets detailing the life, crimes, and supposed final words of the condemned, hawked loudly through the crowd before the person has even finished dying. There are meat pies and drinks for sale, pickpockets quietly working the distracted throng, and a general carnival atmosphere sitting uneasily atop the plain fact that someone is about to be killed in front of everyone. At the gallows itself, the noose is fixed, the cart is drawn abruptly away, and the crowd surges forward and roars. Death by this method is rarely quick or merciful, and the watchers see every bit of it, then drift home afterward to their suppers as though returning from any other ordinary day out. What unsettles the modern mind most isn't really the execution itself, but the sheer festivity surrounding it, the sense that a public killing is simply a fine way to spend an idle afternoon. The authorities intend the whole spectacle as a deterrent, a vivid public warning of what happens to those who break the law. But the crowd doesn't always read it that way at all. For many in attendance, it's simply theater, thrilling and free of charge, and the actual deterrent effect turns out to be doubtful at best. Reformers eventually begin to argue that turning death into entertainment coarsens everyone who watches it, and in time the public procession is finally ended. The executions moved elsewhere, and much later hidden from public view altogether. For now, though, the gallows still stand out in the open, and the crowds keep on coming. And the grim business doesn't always end when the prisoner does, either. For in the very worst cases, punishment is designed to continue for a long time after death, out along the lonely roads beyond the city. For the very worst crimes, death is not actually the end of the punishment. The bodies of certain executed criminals are treated, bound tightly in iron, and hung from a tall post at a crossroads or along a busy public road, left there to swing for months, sometimes even years. This grim practice is called gibbeting, and its whole purpose is simple, deliberate terror. Travelers pass beneath the creaking iron cage, birds circle patiently overhead, and the message is impossible to miss. This is exactly what happens to those who break the law most terribly. It is horrifying, entirely deliberate, and remarkably completely legal. And somehow, over time, people learn to simply walk past it as though it were nothing more than part of the ordinary scenery. The practice is reserved for crimes the age considers especially heinous, murder above all, along with a handful of other offenses judged serious enough to demand punishment that outlasts life itself. An ordinary hanging, after all, ends with a proper burial. Gibbeting denies even that small mercy. The body is treated to slow its decay, then locked into a purpose-made iron frame, a cage of bands and hoops shaped precisely to hold a human form, and hoisted high on a post in some prominent public spot. There it remains, exposed to the weather and the crows, a permanent landmark of dread that everyone in the surrounding district comes to know by sight. The chosen sites are always public and highly deliberate. A gibbet is typically raised near the scene of the original crime, or beside a well-traveled road, or on high ground where it can be seen clearly for miles around. The entire point is visibility. This is punishment functioning as a kind of billboard, a warning aimed not at the dead man himself, who is well beyond caring, but at every living person who happens to pass by and glance up. The authorities want the image burned permanently into memory, want travelers to carry it home in their minds, and think twice before straying towards serious crime themselves. For those living nearby, the gibbet becomes a grim and thoroughly permanent neighbor. The iron creaks and groans steadily in the wind, a sound people learn to recognize and, unsettlingly, to simply ignore over time. Children grow up already knowing the shape on the hill. Local landmarks and even place names attach themselves permanently to the spot. Some remain frightened of it their whole lives, avoiding that stretch of road after dark. Others grow so thoroughly accustomed to it that it fades quietly into the background of daily life, a horror rendered almost ordinary through sheer, grinding familiarity. That may be the strangest part of all, how something truly monstrous can, given enough time, become merely another feature of the landscape. A whole grim folklore grows up around these sites over the years. Tales are told of the crime that led to each one, of ghosts and ill omens, of desperate relatives who sometimes tried, under cover of night, to take a body down for a proper burial, an act the law strictly forbade. The gibbet stands at the meeting point of justice, superstition, and public spectacle, a place where the state's power over the body reaches past the grave itself, and into a kind of endless, iron-bound public display. In time, this too fades away, the practice gradually abandoned as tastes and sensibilities slowly shift, and the public appetite for such displays wanes. The posts eventually come down, the cages rust quietly away in storehouses, and the roads grow peaceful again. But for the length of the Georgian age, the gibbet is a real and thoroughly accepted sight along the roadside. Yet not every corpse in this century stays where it's put, for some bodies are wanted badly enough that people will dig through the earth in the dark of night to take them. Under cover of darkness, tucked into the corners of graveyards, a grim little trade is quietly booming. The growing schools of anatomy need real bodies to teach on, and the law simply does not supply nearly enough of them through legal means. So a market rises to meet the demand. Body snatchers, known rather politely as resurrection men, dig up the freshly buried and sell the bodies on to surgeons for dissection. Grieving families, in response, take to guarding fresh graves personally, building heavy iron cages over coffins and burying their dead deeper in the ground to protect them. To be poor in this era is to fear not only a hard death, but a stolen grave afterward. The living struggle simply to survive, and even the dead here are not always allowed to properly rest. The whole ghastly business springs from a fairly simple mismatch. The study of the human body is advancing rapidly, and surgeons and their students genuinely need real corpses to learn from, to understand how the body is actually built and how best to repair it. But the law permits only a small, steady trickle of legally obtained bodies, nowhere near enough to meet the real hunger of the growing anatomy schools. Wherever demand meets short supply, a market always appears, and here that market deals openly in the dead. It is illegal, thoroughly disreputable, and for those willing to do it, quietly quite profitable. The resurrection men work by night, and they work with a kind of grim, practiced efficiency. A fresh grave is always the target, since a recently buried body is worth considerably more. They dig down at one end of the plot, break open the coffin lid, and carefully draw the body out, often taking pains to leave the shroud and any personal belongings behind, since stealing the body alone carries a noticeably lesser legal penalty than stealing property. The grave is then tidied up to hide any obvious disturbance, and the body is carried off swiftly to be sold before dawn breaks. A skilled gang can empty a grave in a fraction of the time you might expect, vanishing into the darkness with their terrible cargo. For families, the fear this creates is entirely real and genuinely cruel. Burying a loved one is hard enough on its own, without the added dread that the body might be stolen away within days for a dissecting table somewhere across town. So the living take defensive measures, and a strange little industry of grave protection springs up right alongside the grave robbing itself. Heavy iron cages are fixed directly over graves. Bodies are buried deeper, or sealed inside reinforced coffins, or watched over through the vulnerable first nights by relatives keeping a cold, exhausted vigil in the churchyard. The poor, who cannot afford such protections, remain the most at risk of all, their graves the easiest and most tempting targets. The trade also breeds worse things over time. Wherever bodies are worth real money, the temptation naturally arises to supply them by any means necessary, and there are notorious, well-documented cases of individuals who moved from simply robbing graves to darker crimes still, ensuring a steady fresh supply rather than patiently waiting on one. These horrors, when they finally come to light, shock the public deeply and force an uncomfortable public question about how such a market was ever allowed to grow in the first place. The answer lies back in that original mismatch, the law's stubborn refusal to provide bodies honestly, which pushed the whole grim need underground and directly into the hands of the resurrection men. Eventually the law is changed, allowing anatomy schools a more honest and adequate legal supply, and the dark trade in stolen corpses gradually withers away. But for a long stretch of the Georgian age, the fear of the body snatcher is a genuine part of ordinary grief, and the churchyard at night is a place of very real dread. Georgian law does not believe much in half measures. Under a sprawling system later remembered as the Bloody Code, the number of crimes punishable by death climbs steadily into the hundreds. Murder, of course, sits at the top of the list, but so does stealing goods worth only a few shillings, poaching a rabbit from the wrong land, cutting down a tree that isn't yours, or picking a pocket in a crowded street. A hungry child who takes a loaf of bread and a hardened, repeat killer can, at least on paper, face exactly the same rope. The underlying idea is that sheer terror will keep the poor in line. In practice, juries frequently refuse to convict outright, and judges quietly bend the rules wherever they can, because even in this hard age, hanging a person over the price of a handkerchief unsettles nearly everyone who actually has to watch it happen. The logic behind it, such as it is, rests almost entirely on fear. With little in the way of an organized police force and no real system of long-term prisons to speak of, those who write the laws reach for the bluntest available tool, the plain threat of death. If the punishment for even minor theft is severe enough, the thinking goes, then surely no one will dare to steal in the first place. So offense after offense is quietly added to the list of capital crimes, the tally growing steadily over the decades, until it covers a genuinely startling range of acts, many of them small and born purely of ordinary poverty. A great many of these capital offenses concern theft, damage, or trespass against the property of those who actually have property worth protecting. Take goods above a fairly modest value and you can hang. Poach game from a wealthy landowner's estate and you can hang. Damage his fences, forge his signature, or lift his purse, and the rope waits for you too. The law falls hardest, again and again, on the poor who steal because they are hungry or desperate, while the comfortable classes it exists to protect sleep a little easier in its shadow. It is, in the end, a system that treats a full purse as roughly equal in value to a human life. And yet the code is so harsh that it half defeats itself in practice. Faced with a frightened, half-starved defendant accused of some small theft, jurors frequently balk at the idea of sending them to their death, and so they quietly bend the truth to save a life where they can. A jury might value stolen goods at just under the amount required to trigger a hanging, knowing full well the true worth was actually higher, a merciful little fiction that spares the neck while technically satisfying the letter of the law. Judges, too, find their own ways to soften the outcome, and a great many condemned prisoners have their sentences reduced instead to transportation or a term of imprisonment. The severity written on paper is rarely matched in full by the number of actual deaths in practice. Even so, people genuinely do hang for small crimes, and the shadow of the gallows falls across countless minor offenses throughout the age. The uncertainty is really part of the cruelty here. A poor person who steals simply to survive cannot know in advance whether they'll be shown mercy or made into a public example, whether the jury will quietly save them or the judge will simply let the sentence stand as written. The law dangles death over petty acts and then applies it wildly unevenly, which is arguably worse than applying it consistently, since it turns justice into something closer to a lottery played with people's actual lives. Terror, it turns out, makes for a rather poor foundation on which to build real fairness. In the end, reformers come to see the whole system as both cruel and thoroughly ineffective, and the long list of capital crimes is gradually cut back, year by year, until only the very gravest offenses remain punishable by death. But that particular reform lies well in the future, and for now you live in a world where a stolen handkerchief taken in a moment of real need might, with terrible bad luck, end up costing you absolutely everything. Not every punishment ends in death. Some are designed purely to shame. In the pillory, a wooden frame clamps your head and both hands firmly in place, right in the middle of a public square, leaving you helpless before the assembled crowd for hours at a stretch. What happens next depends entirely on that crowd's mood. If they happen to pity you, they simply leave you alone. If they despise you, they pelt you with rotten food, thick mud, dead animals, and considerably worse. And there is nothing at all you can do about it but stand there and endure whatever comes. For some prisoners, it amounts to little more than mild embarrassment. For others, it turns genuinely deadly, as the mob's fury runs far beyond anything the original sentence ever intended. The device itself is simple and brutal in exactly that simplicity. A sturdy wooden post supports a hinged board with holes cut for the neck and both wrists, and once you're locked into it, you cannot move, cannot shield your face, cannot even sit down to rest. You're fixed there, bent forward awkwardly, on display in the busiest, most public spot available, for a set number of hours decided by the court. The whole point is exposure. You are not hidden away quietly in some cell, but held up openly before your entire community as a wrongdoer, forced to bear the judgment of absolutely everyone who happens to pass by. The shame itself is meant to be the sentence. But the pillory is never only about shame, because the crowd rarely settles for simply looking. Onlookers arrive armed with whatever unpleasant things happen to be close at hand, and the person locked in the pillory becomes an easy, helpless target. Rotten vegetables and fruit, thick mud, filth scraped straight from the gutters, dead cats and rats, even the occasional stone are hurled at the defenseless prisoner. Unable to move or protect themselves in any way, they simply have to take it, hour after hour, while the crowd works itself steadily into a frenzy of jeering and throwing. It is, in effect, participatory punishment. The public invited not just to witness the penalty being carried out, but to actively inflict a good part of it themselves. The final outcome depends enormously on who you happen to be and exactly what you did. A popular figure punished for something the crowd genuinely sympathizes with might be treated gently, even cheered and quietly protected. The pillory turned into a strange sort of public triumph. But a prisoner the mob truly despises, someone convicted of a crime that arouses real public hatred, faces something far more dangerous indeed. The barrage can turn savage, the missiles heavier and better aimed, and there are documented cases of prisoners so badly assaulted in the pillory that they simply did not survive the ordeal. A sentence originally meant only to humiliate could, with an angry enough crowd, become a sentence of death delivered by the public's own two hands. That unpredictability is precisely what makes the pillory so genuinely cruel. The court sets the official punishment, but the crowd decides its true severity in the moment, and the prisoner has no real way of knowing in advance which crowd they'll ultimately face. Two people given the exact same sentence might walk away with wildly different experiences, one merely muddy and mortified, the other carried off gravely hurt. The state, in effect, hands part of its own power to punish over to the shifting whims of a mob, then looks conveniently away from whatever follows. Over time, this too comes to seem barbaric, and the pillory eventually falls out of use as attitudes shift toward punishments less dependent on the cruelty of a crowd. But throughout the Georgian age, it stands in the public squares, a familiar and frightening fixture. Fall into debt in Georgian England, and you can genuinely be locked away for it, which raises the fairly obvious question of exactly how you're meant to earn the money to get back out again. Debtors' prisons hold people not for stealing or for violence, but simply for owing money they cannot repay. Families sometimes move in voluntarily to join the imprisoned relative. Children are born and grow up entirely behind the walls, and inmates are expected to pay their own jailers for food, for bedding, and even for the small privilege of lighter chains. The wealthier debtor lives in relative comfort. The poorer one may quite literally starve. It is a system that punishes poverty with even more poverty, and the only reliable way out is somehow to find the very money that landed you inside in the first place. The trap is beautifully, maddeningly circular. A person who cannot pay their debts is imprisoned until they somehow do. But imprisonment itself strips away any real ability to work, to trade, to earn even a single penny toward what's owed. So they sit, month after month, and the debt does not shrink, and the way out only recedes further with every passing week. The only real escape is for the debt to be paid off entirely, whether through the prisoner scraping together funds with outside help, through friends or family covering the amount, or through the creditor eventually simply giving up. Until then, the gates stay firmly shut, and the whole arithmetic of the situation makes no sense whatsoever. Inside, the prison runs on a grim little economy all its own. The jailers themselves are not paid nearly enough to run the place properly, so they make their real living by charging prisoners directly for food, for a bed, for blankets, for the smallest imaginable comforts, even for lighter irons on their wrists and ankles. This means a debtor's actual experience of prison depends entirely on how much money they can still lay their hands on. A prisoner with some funds remaining or generous friends outside might rent a tolerable room, eat reasonably well, and pass the time in relative ease. A prisoner with nothing left is thrown straight into the worst of it, cold, hungry, and dependent entirely on charity just to avoid starving outright behind the walls. The presence of whole families makes the whole picture stranger and sadder still, because a debtor might be held for years on end. Some bring their wives and children in to live alongside them rather than face separation. Children are born and raised entirely within the prison walls, knowing no other home at all. Others come and go freely, working outside to support the imprisoned parent within, carrying food and news back and forth through the gates. The prison becomes a kind of grim little community, a walled-off pocket of the city populated not by hardened criminals, but by the unlucky, the mismanaged, and the simply poor, along with the families who refuse to abandon them. What is so telling about the whole system is that it really isn't about crime at all. The debtors have hurt no one, stolen nothing, harmed absolutely nobody. Their offense is misfortune, a failed venture, a run of bad luck, a simple inability to keep pace with what they owe. Yet the age treats that misfortune as something disturbingly close to a crime, locking the unfortunate away, and in doing so, guaranteeing they can never actually make things right. It reveals a hard truth about the whole century, that poverty itself was often regarded as a kind of guilt, and the poor were made to answer for it accordingly. In time, the cruelty and sheer pointlessness of imprisoning people for debt comes to be widely recognized, and reform slowly dismantles the worst of the system. But for the length of the Georgian age, the debtor's prison stands as a real and looming threat, a place where one spell of bad fortune can quietly swallow years of a life. You're walking home one evening when a group of tough, armed men suddenly surrounds you, and just like that, your entire future is decided for you. During times of war, the Royal Navy grows desperate for sailors, and when volunteers run short, it simply takes them by force. Press gangs roam the ports and streets, seizing able-bodied men off the street and hauling them aboard ships bound for years of brutal service far from home. There is no warning given, no chance to say goodbye, and often no way at all to send word back to a family who may never learn what actually became of you. One moment you're an ordinary man out on an ordinary night. The next, you belong entirely to the sea. The reasoning behind it is coldly, brutally practical. A navy at war needs enormous numbers of men to crew its fleet, and life at sea is so hard, so dangerous, and so poorly paid that nowhere near enough men volunteer for it willingly. So the state grants itself the power to make up the difference by force. Under this system of impressment, naval officers are formally authorized to seize suitable men and put them straight to work aboard ship, whether they actually wish it or not. It is entirely legal. It is thoroughly organized. And it is one of the great open secrets of the age, a form of state-sanctioned kidnapping dressed up neatly in the language of naval necessity. The press gang itself is the sharp end of this whole system, and it does its work with brisk, practiced efficiency. A party of sailors led by an officer moves through a port town, eyes peeled for likely candidates, and the ideal targets are men already used to the sea, sailors pulled from merchant ships, fishermen, watermen, anyone with the strength and skill the Navy genuinely craves. But in a pinch, almost any fit man might do just as well. They corner their quarry in the streets, in the taverns, in the alleys down near the docks, and take him using persuasion where that works and blunt force where it doesn't. Resistance is met with clubs, and once you're taken, you are simply taken. For the man seized, it amounts to a catastrophe arriving entirely without warning. There is no chance to settle his affairs, to say a proper farewell, to arrange anything at all for those who depend on him. He is simply gone, swallowed whole into the Navy, and his family is left behind to wonder and to somehow manage without him. He may spend years at sea, in constant danger from storms, disease, and battle, with wages that arrive late if they arrive at all. Wives lose husbands. Children lose fathers. Small businesses lose the very workers who ran them, all at the whim of a press gang out on some dark night. The grief it causes ripples outward through entire communities. There are supposed to be limits and protections in place. Certain men exempted from the press by their trade or standing, papers that could in theory shield the holder from seizure. But in the heat of an actual manhunt, these rules are often simply ignored. Exemptions get brushed aside, papers disregarded, and the wrong men taken right alongside the right ones. Towns come to genuinely dread the arrival of the press gang, and there are riots, rescues, and pitched street battles as whole communities fight to protect their own. It is a system that pits the raw needs of the state directly against the freedom of the individual, and the individual, more often than not, loses. In time, as the great wars finally end and attitudes shift, the press gang fades into memory, remembered as one of the harsher intrusions of the state into ordinary life. But for now, in a country at war, no fit man near the coast is entirely safe, and a simple walk home after dark can end aboard a ship bound for the far side of the world. Among gentlemen, honor is a fragile and genuinely dangerous thing. An insult exchanged at a card table, a rude remark made about a lady, or simply a bit of bruised pride can all lead to exactly the same conclusion: a formal challenge, a chosen dawn, and two men standing in a quiet field with pistols raised. The rules governing all of this are elaborate and treated with real solemnity, the seconds carefully arranged beforehand, the whole affair conducted as a matter of deep personal principle. And yet the actual outcome is often faintly absurd: two grown men risking death over a spilled drink or a careless word spoken in the heat of a moment. Dueling is technically against the law, but among the fashionable it is quietly, almost universally expected, because in this particular world a man's reputation is somehow worth more than his life. To understand the duel properly, you first have to understand just how much this age prizes personal honor among its gentlemen. A man of standing is expected to defend his name and dignity against any slight whatsoever, and to fail in that duty is to be branded a coward, a fate many consider genuinely worse than death itself. So when one gentleman insults another, whether over cards, over politics, over a woman, or over some entirely trivial matter blown wildly out of proportion, the offended party issues a formal challenge, and the whole machinery of the duel grinds slowly into motion. Backing down is rarely considered an option once pride has been fully engaged, and pride in this world is engaged remarkably, almost comically easily. The process itself is bound by an intricate code, followed with almost religious seriousness by everyone involved. Each man appoints a second, a trusted friend who handles all the practical arrangements and, importantly, tries first to negotiate a peaceful resolution before matters are allowed to go any further. The seconds agree between themselves on the time, the place, the choice of weapons, and the exact conditions of the encounter. Pistols become the fashionable weapon of choice, though swords still have their place in certain circles, and everything is conducted with a kind of formal courtesy, as though the polite rituals could somehow soften the plain fact that the whole exercise is designed to let two men shoot directly at each other. On the appointed morning, the two parties meet at some secluded spot, a quiet field or a stretch of open heath at the edge of town, chosen deliberately for privacy, since the law rather frowns on the entire affair. The men take up their positions, the distance between them is carefully measured, and on a given signal they fire. Sometimes both men miss entirely, whether through poor aim or a deliberate choice not to hit, and honor is declared satisfied, allowing everyone involved to walk away alive. Sometimes one man is wounded, and sometimes one is killed outright, and a quarrel over the smallest of trifles ends with a body in the grass, and a survivor who may well face legal consequences, though gentlemen are often treated with real leniency by courts sympathetic to the whole code of honor. The sheer absurdity of it all is hard to overstate. Men of real intelligence and standing, with everything in the world to live for, gamble their lives over insults that a single moment's patience would have rendered completely meaningless. A careless word, a misunderstood glance, a dispute over a hand of cards, any one of these can end in gunfire at dawn. And yet within the internal logic of the age, it makes a grim kind of sense, because a gentleman's entire social position rests on his honor, and any stain on that honor threatens absolutely everything he is. To refuse the duel outright is, in a real sense, to lose the very thing the duel exists to protect. Eventually, dueling comes to seem as ridiculous to society at large as it already looks to modern eyes, and it fades away under the combined weight of changing attitudes and firmer laws. But throughout the Georgian age it persists, a deadly little theater of pride, played out quietly in fields at dawn, where a single hot word spoken in the wrong company can genuinely cost a man his life. When Georgians want real excitement, they often find it in cruelty toward animals. Crowds gather eagerly to watch bulls set upon by dogs, bears chained and baited, and gamecocks fitted with sharp metal blades to fight one another to the death, with money changing hands on every single outcome. These spectacles are wildly popular across every level of society, from the roughest tavern to the card tables of wealthy gamblers. The noise is deafening, the betting furious, and the suffering total. It is entertainment, plain and simple, and almost nobody in attendance thinks to question it. Standing at the edge of that roaring, jostling crowd, you begin to understand just how ordinary this casual brutality has become, and just how far the world has since traveled from it. These pastimes are woven deeply into the fabric of everyday life, not hidden away as anything shameful, but enjoyed openly as popular fun. There are dedicated pits and rings built specifically for the purpose, and the events draw crowds from every walk of life imaginable. A laborer and a lord might stand shoulder to shoulder at the very same contest, united entirely by the thrill and the wager. Fairs, holidays, and even ordinary afternoons all provide occasion for it, and the calendar of amusements is dotted regularly with these bloody spectacles. To object to any of it would strike most people as odd, even faintly ridiculous, because this is simply, plainly, what entertainment looks like here. The forms it takes are varied and consistently grim. In one, a tethered animal is set upon by a pack of dogs while spectators cheer and lay bets on the outcome. In another, birds are made to fight one another, fitted with sharp metal spurs to make the contest quicker and considerably bloodier, all inside a pit surrounded by shouting, wagering men. There's nothing subtle about any of it. The appeal lies precisely in the violence itself, in the spectacle of one creature pitted directly against another, and the crowd's excitement rises steadily with the ferocity of the struggle. The animals, of course, have no say whatsoever in any of it, and their suffering is essentially the entire point of the show. Gambling is the engine that drives the whole thing. Money changes hands constantly, wagers laid on which animal will prevail, and the stakes involved can be considerable indeed. This is really where much of the passion comes from, because the crowd isn't merely watching, it's betting, its collective fortunes rising and falling with every turn of the contest. The mix of blood and money produces a genuinely fevered atmosphere, loud and frantic, and the events become as much about the gambling itself as about the animals in the pit. A man might win or lose a considerable sum in a single afternoon, all of it hanging entirely on the outcome of a brutal little battle below. What's perhaps most striking, looking back from a safer distance, is the sheer absence of any real unease about it. The cruelty isn't something people wrestle with or feel any particular obligation to justify. It is simply accepted, an unremarkable feature of the age's amusements, no more question than a modern sporting fixture might be today. That so many people could take such open, uncomplicated pleasure in the suffering of animals without any apparent troubling of conscience says a great deal about how differently this world weighed such things. It isn't that Georgians were uniquely wicked people. It's that the very idea of animal welfare, as we understand it today, had barely even begun to take shape. That idea does eventually take hold, sensibilities shift. These blood sports come under growing criticism, and are at last outlawed, marking a real and lasting change in how society comes to regard the treatment of animals. But throughout the Georgian age, they flourish, popular, unquestioned, a roaring corner of everyday life. Travel between towns in Georgian England, and you take both your life and your purse firmly into your own hands. The roads are lonely, poorly policed, and genuinely haunted by highwaymen, mounted robbers who stop coaches at pistol point and relieve the passengers inside of their money and valuables. Popular ballads romanticize these men as dashing, polite gentlemen of the road, but the reality is considerably grimmer, a frightening encounter that can turn violent in an instant. Passengers hide their coins inside their boots, sew jewels carefully into the lining of their coats, and simply pray the journey passes without incident. Every rattling mile through the dark countryside carries the very same quiet question. Is that shape on the horizon just another traveler, or is it the end of your evening? The roads themselves practically invite the danger. They run for long, lonely stretches through open country, heath and woodland, far from any town or any real help, and there is no proper force out there to patrol them. A traveler on such a road is genuinely isolated and exposed, and a mounted robber who knows the terrain well can strike quickly and vanish again just as fast. The stagecoaches carrying passengers and goods between towns make especially tempting targets, laden as they often are with people carrying money and valuables for their journeys. Where there are rich pickings on offer and very little protection, robbers naturally gather, and the highwayman becomes a genuine, everyday hazard of Georgian travel. The robbery itself is a tense and often frightening affair. The highwayman waits patiently along the route, then rides out suddenly to block the coach, pistol drawn, and issues his demand for the passengers to hand over their money and valuables. The travelers, frightened and entirely unarmed, usually comply at once, surrendering their purses, watches, and jewelry rather than risk their lives over it. Some robbers genuinely are courteous, playing the part of the polished gentleman thief the ballads so love to celebrate, but many are not, and the threat of real violence is always present just beneath the surface. A robbery could turn deadly in an instant if a passenger resisted, or if a nervous robber simply panicked, and the pistol pointed through the coach window is very much no stage prop. Travelers develop their own little tricks to protect what they can. Coins get hidden inside boots or sewn discreetly into the lining of clothing. Valuables get tucked into hidden pockets or disguised among ordinary, unremarkable belongings. Some travelers carry a small amount of money openly, ready to surrender it at once in the hope that the robber will be satisfied with that alone and won't go searching further for the rest. It's a nervous little game of concealment, played out on every long journey, and there's never any real guarantee it will actually work. A determined highwayman who suspects more is hidden may search regardless, and the traveler can only hope the ruse holds up under pressure. The strange thing is the genuine glamour that attaches itself to these robbers in the popular imagination. In songs and stories, the highwayman is dashing and bold, a romantic outlaw who robs with a flourish and a smile, and a few real robbers achieve a kind of genuine celebrity, their exploits and their eventual capture followed avidly by the reading public. This romance sits rather oddly against the reality, which is that highway robbery is a frightening crime that leaves travelers genuinely shaken and sometimes badly hurt, its practitioners, when finally caught, facing the full weight of the law. The ballad and the pistol, in the end, tell two very different stories about the exact same man. As the age wears on, better roads, mounted patrols, and changing times gradually make the highwayman's trade far too risky to sustain, and the figure fades slowly from the roads into legend. But for a long stretch of the Georgian era, the danger is entirely real, and a journey through the open countryside carries a genuine edge of fear. Take a deep breath of Georgian city air, and you'll regret it almost immediately. As towns grow larger and coal fires burn steadily in every home and workshop, the sky above the cities turns thick, gray, and genuinely choking. Soot coats every building, blackens the washing hung out on the line, and settles quietly into the lungs of everyone who breathes it in. On the very worst days, the smoke mixes with mist rising off the river into a fog so dense you can barely see across the street, and coughing spreads through the population like a season all its own. It is simply, everyone agrees, the price of living in a bustling, industrious age. You learn to squint, to cover your mouth, and to accept that even the air itself here is quietly working against you. The cause is coal, and coal is everywhere in this city. It heats the homes, cooks the food, and powers the workshops and growing industries of a rapidly expanding city, burned in countless separate fires that pour their smoke into the sky day and night without pause. There is no cleaner alternative on offer, and precious little thought given to the consequences. So the smoke simply accumulates, hanging over the rooftops in a permanent gray pool that never quite clears. The bigger the city grows, the more fires burn to sustain it, and the thicker the air becomes in turn. Prosperity and pollution rise together here, hand in hand, and the price of a warm hearth and a busy trade turns out to be a sky that has largely forgotten how to be blue. The effects are visible on every surface you look at. Soot settles steadily over the whole city, blackening the fine stone of grand buildings, staining the clothes hung out to dry, coating windows in a persistent grimy film. Anything left exposed to the air takes on the same dingy hue eventually, and keeping anything genuinely clean becomes a constant, losing battle. The city wears a permanent layer of filth deposited quietly from above, and the grand buildings meant to impress visitors are steadily dulled by the very air surrounding them. It is a place where cleanliness isn't just difficult to maintain, it's very nearly impossible. Worse than the staining is the harm done to the body. The smoke-laden air is breathed in by absolutely everyone, and it settles deep into the lungs, aggravating coughs, chests, and every kind of breathing complaint imaginable. On days when the smoke combines with damp fog rising off the river, the air grows so thick and foul that it becomes genuinely dangerous, and the sick, the elderly, and the frail suffer worst of all. Waves of coughing and illness sweep steadily through the population whenever the air is at its most severe. And though nobody measures it precisely at the time, the toll on public health is entirely real. The city's own atmosphere is slowly, quietly poisoning the very people who live inside it. The fog itself becomes something of a defining feature of the age, a heavy gray blanket that can descend without warning and swallow the streets whole, reducing visibility to almost nothing at all. In such a fog, the familiar city turns strange and faintly menacing, sounds muffled, shapes looming suddenly out of the murk, ordinary journeys becoming disorienting and painfully slow. It's atmospheric in a genuinely grim way, and it works its way deep into the character of the place, but it's also a real hazard, both choking and blinding, a constant reminder that the air here is thick with considerably more than simple mist. People move through it carefully, handkerchiefs pressed to their faces, waiting patiently for it to lift. All of this is accepted as the natural condition of city life, the unavoidable byproduct of warmth, work, and progress. Only much later will the true cost of such air finally be reckoned with, and real steps taken to clear the skis. In the fine townhouses of the wealthy, an entire hidden world hums quietly along beneath the polished floors above. Servants rise well before dawn and work long after their masters have gone to bed, hauling coal, emptying chamber pots, blacking iron grates, and carrying water up endless flights of stairs. They're expected to be invisible, silent, and endlessly available, moving through back corridors and hidden doorways so as never to be seen actually performing their labor. Their wages are small, their days impossibly long, and their personal freedom almost non-existent. The elegant, effortless comfort of the household above depends entirely on the exhausting, unseen effort of the people laboring below. Grace, it turns out, is very hard work indeed for somebody. The grand house runs on the labor of many hands, arranged in a strict order all their own. There are cooks and kitchen maids, footmen and housemaids, and a whole staff whose combined, coordinated effort keeps the entire household functioning smoothly. Each servant has a defined place and a set of specific duties, and the work itself never really stops. For the comforts the family upstairs enjoys without a second thought, the warm fires, the clean rooms, the meals that seem to appear as if by magic, all of it requires constant, grinding effort behind the scenes. The house functions as a kind of machine, and the servants are its moving parts, laboring entirely out of sight to produce the seamless ease their employers take completely for granted. The days themselves are staggeringly long. A servant rises before the rest of the family, often well before dawn, to light the fires and begin the endless round of daily tasks, and continues working right up until the household finally retires for the night, which may be very late indeed. In between comes a ceaseless flow of duties: cleaning, carrying, fetching, serving, much of it heavy and genuinely unpleasant. Coal must be hauled up from the cellars, water carried up flight after flight of stairs, chamber pots emptied, grates cleaned and blacked, floors scrubbed on hands and knees, and all of it done again, identically, the very next day. There is little rest and even less genuine respite, and a servant's own personal time is a scarce and precious thing indeed. Perhaps the strangest expectation placed on them is invisibility itself. A well-run household prizes servants who can complete their work entirely without being seen or heard, appearing only when actually summoned, and otherwise moving through the house by hidden means. Backstairs and concealed passages are built into these grand homes precisely so that servants can go about their labors without ever crossing paths with the family, and a servant caught idling, or simply seen where they shouldn't be, risks a sharp rebuke. They are meant to be present and constantly useful, yet somehow, at the same time, entirely absent, the invisible hands that quietly make the whole household work. It is a peculiar demand indeed, to labor constantly while pretending you're not really there at all. For all this effort, the rewards remain meager. Wages are low, and though a servant's room and board are typically provided, their personal freedom is heavily constrained, their lives largely dictated entirely by the needs of the household they serve. A servant's fortunes depend enormously on the character of their employers. A kind household can offer a tolerable, even genuinely secure life, while a harsh one can make the work an absolute misery. There's little job security either, since a servant might be dismissed on a whim, and a lost position is always a serious matter with real consequences. It is, in the end, a life of dependence, comfort for the master, bought quietly with the toil of the servant. Yet below stairs is also its own small community, complete with its own hierarchy, its own gossip, its own friendships and small pleasures, a world running in parallel to the grand one upstairs. The servants know the family's private secrets, share their own jokes and quarrels, and build genuine lives within the narrow space allowed them. Death is everywhere in Georgian England, and rather than hide from it, people wrap it carefully in ritual. Mourning has its own strict rules governing black clothing, its own jewelry crafted from the hair of the departed, its own quiet keepsakes meant to hold on to those who are gone. With disease common in life often frustratingly short, few families remain untouched by loss for very long, and children in particular are lost at rates that would break a modern heart entirely. And yet through all of it, people carry on with a stubborn, tender resilience, holding funerals, keeping mementos, and remembering their dead with real, lasting care. In a world this fragile, grief isn't an interruption to ordinary life. It is simply woven into the fabric of it. The nearness of death shapes nearly everything about how people live. Disease moves easily through crowded towns. Medicine, as we've seen, can do very little to stop it, and life expectancy remains low, dragged down above all by the constant loss of the very young. A single family might have several children and still lose more than one of them along the way, and few households escape the death of someone dear over the course of a lifetime. This isn't a rare tragedy visited on the unlucky few. It's a common thread running through nearly every life. People grow up knowing loss intimately, expecting it, living always within its reach, in a way that's genuinely hard for a safer age to fully imagine. Because death is so ever-present, the age wraps it in a great deal of ceremony and careful attention. Mourning is governed closely by established custom, with black clothing worn for set, specific periods, and the depth of one's grief signaled openly through both dress and manner. Funerals are treated as important occasions, marked with real solemnity, and the rituals surrounding death give shape and meaning to loss that might otherwise feel simply unbearable. These customs aren't empty formality. They're a way of honoring the dead and helping the living move steadily through their grief, a structure to lean on when sorrow finally comes calling. To mourn properly in this world is to show real love and respect for the one who is gone. The keepsakes are among the most touching part of it all. People treasure objects that keep the departed feeling close, and one of the most striking is jewelry made using the actual hair of the dead, worn as a way to carry a piece of the loved one always, close against the skin. Lockets, rings, and other small mementos hold these tiny physical remnants, turning grief into something that can literally be held in the hand and worn against the heart. There's a real tenderness in this practice that cuts cleanly through the centuries. The simple, human wish to hold on to those we've lost, to keep some small trace of them near even after they're truly gone. The loss of children weighs heaviest of all, and so many are lost so young that the age develops its own particular ways of remembering them, its own commemorative portraits, its own small mementos, its own quiet, private grief. Parents who bury their children carry a sorrow that no ritual can ever fully ease, and yet they endure, holding fast to memory and to one another, and go on with the ordinary business of living because they simply must. There's a quiet heroism in that endurance, in loving deeply within a world that so often takes the beloved away, and in refusing again and again to let grief harden into despair. What comes through most clearly, looking back, is not morbidness but genuine resilience. A people who lived close to death and met it with ceremony, memory, and love rather than denial, honoring their dead while holding their living close. Marriage in Georgian England is often far less about love and far more about property, alliance, and simple survival. Among the wealthy, matches are carefully arranged for land and useful family connections, with young people paraded before potential suitors rather like goods laid out at a fair. Among the poorer sort, there's a stranger option still available: quick, cheap weddings performed in the shadow of a debtor's prison, where couples can be married on the spot with little more than a small fee and a willing officiant. Some of these are eloping lovers. Some are simply drunk. Some are being married against their own better judgment entirely. It's chaotic, occasionally scandalous, and, in time, about to be swept away entirely by new laws. But for now, love in this world comes with some very fine print attached. For the wealthy, marriage is a serious matter of family strategy first, with love, if it enters into the equation at all, considered very much a secondary concern. A good match brings land, money, useful connections, and enhanced social status, and parents arrange the unions of their children with these practical goals firmly in mind throughout. A young woman of real fortune is treated as a prize to be bestowed with real care, her eventual marriage a careful negotiation between two families over property and mutual advantage. Young people are introduced to one another with a shrewd eye toward their suitability, their worth measured openly in acres and annual income, and personal feeling comes a distant second to the broader interests of the family. It is, in truth, considerably less a courtship than it is a merger. The great social occasions of fashionable society double conveniently as marriage markets, where eligible young people are put on display and quietly appraised by watchful families. The endless season of balls, assemblies, and social gatherings serves a clear underlying purpose beneath its elegant surface, bringing marriageable men and women together under the careful, watchful eyes of their relations. A young woman is presented formally to society, her charms and her fortune both duly noted, her prospects assessed openly by suitors and their families alike. It's a polished, mannered affair on the surface, but the underlying business is plain enough to anyone paying attention. The careful pairing off of the right people for entirely practical reasons, with the young people themselves often having remarkably little say in the final outcome. At the opposite end of society, marriage takes on a far rougher and considerably quicker form. In certain parts of the city, notably in the shadow of the debtors' prisons, a lively trade flourishes in fast, cheap weddings, performed with none of the usual formalities or waiting periods. For a small fee, a couple could be married on the spot by an officiant willing to ask no awkward questions whatsoever, and this convenience attracts all manner of people: runaway lovers escaping disapproving families, couples in a genuine hurry, and some who barely seem to know what they're actually doing. All of them find their way, one way or another, to these hasty little unions. It is marriage stripped right down to its barest legal bones, quick, quiet, and very often regretted afterward. These clandestine weddings cause no end of real trouble, precisely because they're so easy and so entirely private. They open the door to all sorts of abuses: hasty marriages entered into rashly, unions arranged through trickery or outright pressure, and bitter disputes over whether a marriage had even validly taken place at all. A person might find themselves bound for life by a ceremony conducted in a matter of minutes, sometimes under genuinely questionable circumstances, and the lack of proper records and safeguards makes the whole business ripe for scandal and outright fraud. It's a loophole in the marriage laws large enough to drive a great deal of misfortune straight through, and its consequences are frequently unhappy ones. Eventually, the law steps in to close the loophole entirely, imposing proper requirements on marriage and bringing an end to these instant unions once and for all. But for a time, the contrast stands genuinely stark: the grand, calculated matches of the wealthy on one hand, and the reckless, whispered weddings of the poor on the other, both of them, so very often, having remarkably little to do with love at all. Step into the fairs and showrooms of Georgian England, and you'll find that the public appetite for spectacle extends even to human beings themselves. Individuals with unusual bodies, rare conditions, or striking physical differences are put on display before paying audiences who come simply to stare and marvel. Some of those exhibited earn a genuine living this way and manage their own affairs with real skill. Many others have little say in the matter at all, and even less protection. It's treated as harmless wonder, a fascination with the extraordinary, but beneath the spectacle lies a hard truth about how easily this age turns real people into objects. What one century calls entertainment, another remembers with something closer to a wince. The fascination grows out of a genuine curiosity about the unusual, but it plays out, again and again, in ways that strip away a person's basic dignity. Someone whose appearance or condition set them apart from the ordinary could become a public attraction, exhibited at fairs, in taverns, or in rented rooms, with crowds paying eagerly to look. The public comes in real numbers, drawn by the promise of seeing something genuinely rare, and the person on display becomes the entire entertainment, their physical difference the whole substance of the show. That a human being could be presented this way, as a marvel to be gawked at, was accepted as entirely ordinary, an unremarkable feature of the age's amusements. For some of those exhibited, the arrangement offered a real measure of agency, and even genuine prosperity. A person able to manage their own showing could earn a real, substantial living from it, control how they were presented to the public, and secure a degree of independence that other paths in life might never have offered someone in their circumstances. In a world with vanishingly few options for anyone who fell outside the ordinary, exhibiting oneself could be a perfectly rational choice, a way to turn a difference that might otherwise have brought poverty or exclusion into a genuine source of income. These individuals were not simply victims, but people making the best of a narrow, difficult set of possibilities available to them. For many others, however, there was little real choice involved and even less protection. Some were displayed with scant regard for their own wishes, their difference exploited openly by others purely for profit, their consent barely considered at any point in the arrangement. The line between willing performer and exploited spectacle was often badly blurred. And the real power in these arrangements rarely lay with the person actually on show. Vulnerable people could easily find themselves treated as property, their basic humanity treated as secondary to their value as a curiosity, and there was little in the way of law or custom available to safeguard them. The spectacle that entertained the crowd could be, for its subject, a genuine form of quiet degradation. What's uncomfortable to sit with, looking back, is the sheer casualness of it all. The way an entire society could pay to stare openly at fellow human beings and think nothing whatsoever of it. The crowds did not, for the most part, see any real cruelty in what they were doing. They saw wonder, novelty, a diverting way to spend an afternoon. That failure to recognize the basic dignity of the person behind the spectacle is precisely what marks the practice as a product of its particular time. A reminder that any age can be blind to the humanity of those it turns into objects of curiosity. The problem was never that Georgians were uniquely unkind people, but that they simply hadn't yet learned to look at difference and see, first and always, a person. In time, attitudes do shift, and the open exhibition of people as curiosities comes to be seen for the real indignity it always was, fading gradually as a fuller sense of human dignity slowly takes hold across society. For many convicted of lesser crimes, the sentence handed down is not death, but exile, shipped across the ocean to labor in distant colonies for a fixed term of years, often never to return home at all. Torn from family and everything they've ever known, these convicts cross the sea in crowded, disease-ridden ships toward a life of hard, unfamiliar toil in a genuinely strange land. For some, it amounts to a slow death sentence in disguise. For a rare, fortunate few, it becomes an unlikely second chance instead, a genuine fresh start on the far side of the world. Transportation offers the age a convenient answer to a genuinely difficult question. The prisons are inadequate for long-term housing. The public appetite for hanging every petty offender who comes through the courts is limited, even in this hard century. And yet something must still be done with those convicted of crimes too serious to simply ignore, but not quite grave enough to warrant the gallows. The solution settled on is to send them away entirely, across the ocean, to labor in the colonies for a set term of years. It removes the offender cleanly from the country, supplies useful hands to distant settlements badly in need of labor, and spares the authorities back home the trouble and expense of housing them indefinitely. For the state, it is tidy and eminently practical. For the person actually transported, it is the loss of nearly everything they've ever known. The sentence begins with a genuinely dreadful voyage. Convicts are loaded onto ships and carried across vast stretches of open ocean in conditions that are cramped, filthy, and thoroughly rife with disease. The journey is long and often perilous, and not everyone survives it, since sickness moves easily through the crowded holds, and the long weeks at sea inevitably take their toll. Those who do endure the crossing arrive finally in a strange land, far from anything familiar, to begin years of hard labor under a hot and unfamiliar sky. The sheer distance involved is so great that return, for most, is simply unimaginable, the old life severed as completely and permanently as if by death itself. What awaits at the other end is years of genuine toil in service to the colony, work that is hard and often harsh, in a place utterly foreign to everything the convict has ever known before. Family, friends, and home are all left behind, likely forever, and the letters that might once have connected them stretch increasingly thin across an entire ocean, and often fail to arrive at all. For many, transportation amounts to exile in the fullest possible sense, a life sentence in all but name, ending far from the land of their birth, surrounded entirely by strangers. The grief of that separation, for the transported and for those left behind alike, remains one of the quieter sorrows of the age. And yet, for a fortunate few, the story does bend toward something genuinely better. Once a term of labor has been fully served, some find that this distant land offers real opportunities the crowded, rigidly hierarchical old country never would have offered them. A chance to work land of their own for the first time, to build a genuine life, to become something considerably more than the poor and desperate figures they had once been back home. The very ocean that carried them into exile also carried them well beyond the reach of their old circumstances, and a small handful seized the chance to begin again entirely. It is a bitter irony indeed that a punishment meant purely to cast people out could, on rare occasions, set them free in ways they had genuinely never known before. Before transportation, before the gallows, before any sentence at all is handed down, there is the waiting. And in London, that waiting very often happens inside the walls of Newgate Prison, a building whose very name is enough to make an honest Georgian shudder. Newgate holds everyone together in one crowded, chaotic space, murderers awaiting trial beside debtors awaiting a miracle, pickpockets beside forgers, the genuinely dangerous beside the merely unlucky. There is no real separation by offense, no attempt at rehabilitation, no comfort of any kind. There is only stone, iron, and the slow, grinding machinery of Georgian justice working its way toward a verdict. The building itself is old, damp, and perpetually overcrowded, its cells built to hold far fewer people than are actually crammed inside them at any given time. Fever moves through the prison population with horrifying ease, a sickness so common and so deadly that it earns its own grim nickname, jail fever, and it doesn't limit itself politely to the prisoners. Judges, lawyers, and court officials who spend time in the building's fetid air have been known to sicken and die themselves, carrying the infection out of the prison and into the courtroom, a chilling reminder that disease respects no rank in this century. Money, as with so much else in Georgian life, determines the actual experience of imprisonment. A prisoner with funds can pay the keeper for a private cell, decent food, and even visits from friends and family. A prisoner with nothing is thrown into the communal wards, where the crowding is worst, the food thinnest, and the risk of fever highest. The keepers themselves, like the jailers of the debtors' prisons, are poorly paid by the Crown and make up the difference by charging inmates for every small comfort imaginable. A blanket, a candle, a lighter set of irons. Justice, it turns out, has a price list, and the poor pay the steepest rate of all. For those awaiting trial, the wait itself can stretch on for weeks or months, with no guarantee of a fair hearing at the end of it. Trials themselves are often shockingly brief by modern standards, a matter of minutes rather than days, with little in the way of formal legal representation for the accused. A prisoner might stand before the judge, hear the charges read, offer what defense they can manage on their own, and receive a verdict all within the same short session. For the condemned, the walk from Newgate to the gallows becomes the final, terrible chapter of a story that began, for many, with nothing more than hunger and bad luck. And yet even within these grim walls, a strange kind of ordinary life persists. Prisoners form their own small communities, their own hierarchies, their own quiet friendships forged in shared misfortune. Chaplains visit to offer what spiritual comfort they can. Family members bring food and news from outside when they're able. It is a hard, degrading existence, but a thoroughly human one, lived out by people who, for all their crimes real or alleged, still find ways to endure. Reform of the prison system lies decades in the future, and for now, Newgate stands as one more grim institution in a century that seems to specialize in them. Not everyone who falls on hard times in Georgian England ends up in a debtor's prison or a common lodging house. For many, the first and last resort is the parish itself, which under the old poor laws bears a legal responsibility to support its own destitute residents. This support, such as it is, comes in a handful of forms: a small weekly allowance handed out to the elderly or the sick, work found for the able-bodied, or, in the harshest cases, admission to the parish workhouse, a place designed less to comfort the poor than to make poverty itself feel like a punishment worth avoiding. The workhouse operates on a simple, unforgiving principle. Conditions inside must always be worse than the meanest situation available outside its walls, so that only the truly desperate will ever choose to enter. Families are often separated on arrival, husbands housed apart from wives, children apart from parents, each assigned to labor suited to their age and strength. The work itself is deliberately tedious and exhausting, picking apart old rope into fibers called oakum, breaking stone, grinding corn by hand, tasks chosen as much for their capacity to occupy idle hands as for any real economic value they produce. The food is plain, monotonous, and doled out in carefully measured, meager portions. A thin gruel for breakfast, a little bread and cheese through the day, perhaps a scrap of meat on Sundays if the parish coffers allow it. Discipline is strict, and the atmosphere is one of quiet, grinding humiliation rather than open cruelty. The sense, constantly reinforced, that to need help at all is itself a kind of failing that must be paid for in dignity, since it cannot be paid for in coin. For the elderly poor with no family left to care for them, for widows with small children and no means of support, for the sick and the disabled who cannot labor, the workhouse is often the only alternative to starving quietly in the street. Some parishes administer the system with a measure of genuine compassion, doing what they can within a badly flawed structure. Others treat their poor with real contempt, viewing every shilling spent on relief as a shilling wasted. The variation from parish to parish means that a person's fate can depend enormously on nothing more than the particular patch of ground they happen to be born on. Outdoor relief, support given to the poor while they remain in their own homes, is generally preferred by the poor themselves, and preferred too by parishes looking to save money on the considerable expense of running a workhouse. A small weekly stipend, a bit of bread, perhaps some cast-off clothing, allows a family to scrape by without surrendering their independence entirely. But as the population grows and the cost of supporting the poor rises steadily along with it, pressure mounts across the country to push more people into the workhouses instead, where costs can be more tightly controlled and the poor more closely supervised. It is a system built not from cruelty for its own sake, but from a genuine anxiety about cost, order, and the fear that generosity might somehow encourage idleness. An anxiety that shapes the lives of the poorest Georgians as surely as any law against theft or vagrancy. Disease stalks every corner of Georgian life, but none looms larger in the public imagination than smallpox, a sickness so common and so disfiguring that its marks are simply an accepted part of many ordinary faces. It moves through cities and villages alike with terrible regularity, killing a significant share of those it infects outright, and leaving many of the survivors permanently scarred, their skin pitted with the marks the disease leaves behind. A childhood without at least one brush with smallpox is, for much of this century, the exception rather than the rule. The disease shows no particular respect for rank or fortune. It moves through royal palaces just as readily as it moves through crowded slums, and history remembers more than one monarch and noble whose face, and sometimes whose life, was claimed by it. For families of every class, the arrival of smallpox in the household is a moment of genuine terror, since there is little to be done beyond keeping the patient comfortable, isolated where possible, and waiting to see whether the fever will break or whether it will take its victim entirely. Toward the latter part of the Georgian era, a genuine glimmer of hope arrives in the form of inoculation, and later, a much safer method involving cowpox that gradually earns the name vaccination. The idea that deliberately exposing a person to a milder form of disease might protect them from the far deadlier version strikes many at the time as strange, even alarming, and it takes real courage, real persistence, and no small amount of public argument before the practice gains wide acceptance. Early inoculation itself carries real risk, since it uses live smallpox material and occasionally triggers the very disease it's meant to prevent. But gradually, as safer techniques develop and spread, a small but growing number of Georgians begin to escape a fate that had seemed, for generations, simply unavoidable. Beyond smallpox, a whole roster of other diseases takes its steady toll throughout the century. Typhus bred in crowded, unsanitary conditions, tuberculosis working its slow way through the lungs of the poor and the wealthy alike, and periodic waves of fever that sweep through entire neighborhoods with little warning and less mercy. Doctors, as we've already seen, have precious little real ability to treat any of it, and the burden of nursing the sick falls, as it so often does, on wives, mothers, and daughters, who tend the ill with whatever herbal remedies, prayers, and sheer determination they can muster. What emerges from all of this is a population that lives with a familiarity toward illness and death that later, say for centuries, would find genuinely hard to bear. Every cough carries a little extra weight. Every fever prompts a little extra worry. And yet life goes on regardless, because it must, with people marrying, raising families, and building futures under the constant, quiet shadow of diseases that medicine simply cannot yet touch. It is a testament to a kind of resilience that doesn't announce itself loudly, but simply persists, day after uncertain day. Step into a coffee house in any Georgian town of real size, and you step into something genuinely new in the world. A place where news, opinion, and gossip circulate as freely as the coffee itself, and where a man of modest means can sit at the same table as a gentleman of real fortune, provided he can afford the entrance fee of a single penny. These establishments have sprung up across the country over the preceding decades, and by now they form a kind of informal nervous system for the whole nation, carrying word of politics, trade, scandal, and war from city to city, almost as fast as a writer can travel. Inside, the atmosphere is loud, smoky, and thoroughly absorbing. Newspapers, expensive to buy individually but shared freely once inside, are read aloud to those who cannot read for themselves, their contents debated hotly across crowded tables. Merchants conduct real business here, striking deals over a hot drink that would once have required a formal meeting elsewhere. Writers and would-be philosophers hold court, testing out ideas on anyone willing to listen and argue back. Politics is discussed with a freedom that would have seemed almost unthinkable in an earlier age, and more than one coffee house becomes closely associated with a particular set of opinions, a particular trade, or a particular profession, so that a stranger in a new town can often guess a great deal about local affairs simply by noting which house draws which crowd. The coffee itself is often bitter and poorly brewed by later standards, sometimes stretched with cheaper ingredients in much the same spirit as the adulterated bread and milk found elsewhere in this account. But nobody is really there purely for the beverage. They are there for the conversation, for the news, for the simple pleasure of being somewhere things are actually happening. Women, it should be said plainly, are generally excluded from these spaces, which remain overwhelmingly the domain of men. One more small reminder of just how unevenly Georgian society distributes its pleasures alongside its burdens. Beyond the coffee house, news travels through other channels too. Printed broadsides and pamphlets, sold cheaply on street corners, spread word of executions, disasters, political scandals, and royal announcements to a public hungry for information in a century, without any faster means of mass communication. Town criers still walk certain streets calling out important notices to those who cannot read at all. And gossip itself, passed mouth to mouth through markets, taverns, and doorways, remains perhaps the fastest and most reliable news service of them all, however unreliable its actual accuracy might prove to be. In a world without telegraph or newspaper delivered daily to every door, the coffee house stands as one of the genuine bright spots of Georgian public life. A place where, for the price of a penny, anyone at all could feel, for an hour or two, genuinely connected to the wider world. As evening falls and the working day finally winds down, those with a little spare coin and an appetite for spectacle might make their way toward the theater, one of the few entertainments in Georgian England that manages to be both wildly popular and, occasionally, genuinely uplifting rather than simply cruel. The playhouses of the larger towns draw crowds from across the social spectrum, from fine ladies in the boxes to laborers crammed into the cheap standing area known as the pit, all gathered together, however briefly, under the same roof for the same show. The atmosphere inside is nothing at all like the hushed reverence of later theatrical tradition. Audiences talk loudly through performances, call out comments to the actors, and occasionally hurl fruit or worse at a performance they judge unworthy of their attention. Popular actors become genuine celebrities, their faces recognized on the street, their private lives the subject of endless public gossip. A truly bad performance risks being shouted off the stage entirely, while a beloved one might be interrupted repeatedly by cheers and demands for an encore. It is participatory theater in every sense, the crowd as much a part of the evening's entertainment as anything happening on stage. The plays themselves range enormously in tone and quality, from serious tragedy to broad comedy, to elaborate spectacle involving trapdoors, painted scenery, and the occasional genuinely dangerous stunt. Between the main performances, audiences are treated to smaller acts, singers, dancers, acrobats, sometimes even performing animals, turning a single evening at the theater into something closer to a variety show than a single focused production. Ticket prices vary enormously by seating location, allowing the theater to draw its remarkably wide social mix, though the different classes of patron rarely mingle much once inside. The boxes, the pit, and the cheapest gallery seats each their own distinct social world. For all its rowdiness, the theater offers something genuinely valuable in a hard century, a shared space where imagination and spectacle can briefly outweigh the grinding difficulty of ordinary life. A laborer who has spent the day hauling coal or the week dodging press gangs can, for the price of a cheap gallery seat, lose himself for a few hours in a story of romance, adventure, or comedy that has nothing whatsoever to do with his own circumstances. It is one of the few corners of Georgian public life where the cruelty documented throughout so much of this account genuinely recedes, replaced instead by something closer to simple, shared human delight. Walking home afterward through streets now properly dark, lit only by the occasional oil lamp or the lanterns carried by link boys hired to guide pedestrians safely through the gloom, you carry with you a small, warm memory to set against everything else the day has held. It is a reminder that even in the hardest of centuries, people still found their way toward laughter, toward story, toward the simple pleasure of being entertained together in the dark. Not every Georgian story unfolds within the noise and filth of the city. Out beyond the town walls, across the fields and hedgerows of the English countryside, a different but equally hard existence plays out for the agricultural laborer, the farmhand, and the rural poor who make up the great majority of the nation's population for most of this century. If the city offers gin, filth, and spectacle, the countryside offers back-breaking labor, dependence on the weather, and a poverty every bit as real, if considerably quieter. The agricultural laborer's year follows the rhythm of the harvest, and that rhythm shows no mercy at all for the human body beneath it. Spring brings plowing and planting, long days bent double over furrows of earth, hands raw from handling rough tools from dawn until the light finally fails. Summer brings haymaking and the first stages of harvest, work so intense that whole families, children included, are pressed into the fields to bring in the crop before weather turns it to waste. Autumn brings the main harvest itself, a frantic, exhausting race against the calendar, and winter, when the fields lie fallow, brings a different kind of hardship entirely. Thin employment, cold cottages, and the constant, gnawing worry of how to stretch a summer's wages through months with little work available. Wages for farm labor are meager even by the low standards of the age. And they're frequently paid partly in kind rather than coin. A portion of grain, the use of a small garden plot, perhaps a cottage tied directly to the job, meaning that losing your position could mean losing your home in the very same stroke. The enclosure of common land, a process gathering real pace throughout the Georgian era, strips many rural families of rights they had long relied on. The ability to graze a cow or a few geese on shared pasture, to gather firewood from common ground, to grow a bit of extra food on land that had never technically belonged to them, but had always been available for use. as these commons are fenced off and absorbed into the estates of larger landowners. A whole way of scraping by quietly disappears, pushing more and more rural families toward the very poverty the poor laws were designed, however inadequately, to address. The rural cottage itself, home to the average laboring family, is a simple, often crowded structure. One or two rooms serving an entire household, a thatched roof prone to leaking, a dirt or rough stone floor, and precious little in the way of real furniture beyond a bed, a table, and perhaps a single chest for what few possessions the family owns. Cooking happens over an open hearth. Water is hauled from a nearby well or stream, and the whole family, parents and children alike, sleeps within a few feet of one another, warmth in winter mattering rather more than privacy at any time of year. And yet the countryside offers things the city cannot. Air that, whatever its other hardships, doesn't choke with coal smoke. A closer, if harder, relationship with the land that provides food directly rather than through a chain of adulterating middlemen. A sense of community in small villages that, for all their own gossip and rivalry, rarely reaches the anonymous, crushing scale of London's poorest quarters. It is a harder life in many ways, and a simpler one in others, and for the great majority of Georgians who never see the inside of a fashionable townhouse or hear the roar of a hanging day crowd, it is simply life as it is, governed by weather, by harvest, and by a landowner whose whims can matter every bit as much as any law passed in a distant parliament. As the Georgian era draws toward its close, a new kind of labor begins creeping across parts of the country, one that will come to define the century that follows even more than it defines this one: the factory. Water-powered and later steam-powered mills rise along rivers in the north of England, drawing workers away from scattered cottage industry and into large, centralized buildings where dozens or hundreds of hands labor together under a single roof, tending machines that spin and weave cloth at a pace no individual craftsman could ever hope to match alone. And just as with the chimneys before them, it is children who are sent in first to do some of the hardest and most dangerous of this new work. Small bodies prove useful for crawling beneath moving machinery to clear jammed threads or retrieve dropped tools, for squeezing into gaps too narrow for any adult, for hands nimble enough to manage delicate spinning work hour after hour. Orphans and the children of the desperately poor are sent to these mills in considerable numbers, sometimes traveling great distances from parish workhouses in the south to mill towns in the north, their labor effectively sold in batches to factory owners hungry for cheap, compliant hands. The hours are staggering by any measure: 12, 14, sometimes 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, with the youngest workers roused before dawn and worked well past dark, especially when a mill runs through the night to make full use of its expensive machinery. The work itself is monotonous and dangerous in equal measure. Fingers are lost to moving parts. Lungs fill steadily with cotton dust and fine particles that will trouble their owners for the rest of their lives, however long those lives turn out to be. Exhausted children, worked well past any reasonable limit, doze at their stations and pay for the lapse with injuries that would, in a kinder system, never have been allowed to happen in the first place. Discipline in these early mills is harsh, enforced through fines, beatings, and the constant threat of dismissal, a threat that carries real weight for families depending entirely on a child's wages to survive. There is, as yet, no legal limit on how young a child might begin working, no restriction on the hours a mill owner might demand, no safety requirement governing the machinery itself. The mill owner's primary obligation is to his shareholders and his own profit margin, and the welfare of the children laboring on his floor factors into that calculation only as far as it affects productivity. It will take the dawning years of the century that follows, and decades of hard-fought reform, before laws finally begin to limit child labor, restrict working hours, and mandate at least some basic safety measures within these new factories. For now, though, as the Georgian age winds toward its close, the mill stands alongside the chimney and the coal mine as one more place where the comforts of a growing, increasingly wealthy nation are quietly built on the backs, and occasionally the crushed fingers, of children who never had much choice in the matter at all. Along the coasts of Georgian England, a different sort of crime flourishes, one viewed by a great many ordinary people not as crime at all, but as simple common sense smuggling. Heavy taxes, called duties, are levied on all manner of imported goods, tea, brandy, silk, tobacco, and more, and those duties push the legal price of such goods well beyond what most ordinary families can comfortably afford. Where there is a wide gap between what people want and what they can legally buy, smugglers step neatly into the space between, running goods ashore under cover of darkness and selling them on at a fraction of the tax price. The trade is remarkably well organized in many coastal areas, involving entire communities rather than a handful of shadowy outlaws, fishermen who know every cove and hidden inlet along a stretch of coast, farmers willing to hide contraband in barns and cellars for a modest fee, innkeepers who pass along word of when a shipment is expected, and when it might be safer to keep the local customs officers occupied elsewhere with a free drink or two. Even respectable townsfolk, the very sort who would never dream of picking a pocket, think nothing at all of buying smuggled tea or brandy at a fair price, reasoning that the tax itself is the real injustice, not the evasion of it. The customs service, tasked with stopping all this, is chronically understaffed and often outmatched, both in numbers and in local knowledge, by smuggling gangs who know their home territory intimately and can call on the sympathy, or at least the silence, of the surrounding community. Confrontations between smugglers and customs officers do turn violent on occasion, sometimes fatally so, and the more organized gangs operate with a level of ruthlessness that belies their popular, romantic reputation. But for every violent confrontation, there are countless quiet transactions carried out with barely a ripple, a keg rolled into a cellar under cover of night, a packet of tea passed quietly across a counter with a knowing look and no questions asked. The government's response, over the course of the century, swings between harsh crackdowns and grudging tax reductions, as successive administrations slowly come to recognize that duties set too high simply guarantee a thriving black market rather than genuine revenue. It is a lesson learned slowly and repeatedly throughout the Georgian era, and smuggling, in one form or another, persists along the English coastline for the length of the age and well beyond it. One more example of a century where the letter of the law and the lived reality of ordinary people frequently point in entirely different directions. We've already spent time on the towering, powdered wig, but a Georgian wardrobe holds a great deal more absurdity than hair alone, and no walk through this century would be complete without a proper look at the clothes themselves. For gentlemen of fashion, the goal is a silhouette built almost entirely around display. Coats cut narrow through the shoulders and flared dramatically at the waist, waistcoats embroidered with more thread than many laborers earn in a month, breeches fastened tight at the knee above stockings chosen specifically to show off a well-turned calf. A truly fashionable man, known by this point in the century as a dandy or a macaroni, might spend more on a single embroidered waistcoat than a servant earns in an entire year of invisible, exhausting labor. The shoes alone deserve real attention. Heeled, buckled, often made from delicate materials never intended to survive contact with an actual Georgian street, they are worn less for walking than for standing about being admired in a drawing room or a box at the theater. A gentleman genuinely committed to fashion might change his entire outfit several times across a single day. A morning ensemble for informal calls, an afternoon outfit for walking or riding, and a formal evening dress for dinner or a ball, each one requiring its own careful selection of coat, waistcoat, breeches, and accessories, all assembled with the considerable help of a valet whose entire job amounts to keeping his master looking effortlessly put together. For ladies, fashion swings across the Georgian decades from wide, structured hoops that could make simply walking through a doorway a genuine logistical challenge, to the lighter, higher-waisted muslin gowns that come into vogue toward the century's close, a style so thin and so revealing by the standards of the day that critics worry loudly about young women catching their deaths of cold in the pursuit of looking fashionably classical. Underneath it all sits a genuine architecture of undergarments, stays, or corsets, laced tight enough to shape the body into the fashionable silhouette of the moment, petticoats layered for warmth and structure alike, and for the truly committed, panniers or hoops wide enough to require sideways navigation through a crowded doorway. Color and fabric both carry real social weight. Bright dyes, delicate silks, and fine imported cottons all cost real money, and a glance at a stranger's clothing tells an experienced Georgian a great deal about their income, their occupation, and their aspirations, all before a single word is exchanged. The poor, by contrast, make do with sturdy wool and coarse linen, dyed if at all with cheap, muted colors that fade quickly and show every stain and repair. Clothes are mended, handed down, and mended again until they can genuinely be mended no further, then sold on to the second-hand clothing dealers who do a brisk trade recycling garments down through the social ranks until they finally end their working life as rags. For all its absurdity, fashion here serves a real purpose beyond simple vanity. In a society with no photographs, no mass media beyond the newspaper and the printed pamphlet, clothing functions as one of the primary ways a person announces exactly who they are, or who they'd like to be taken for, to everyone they pass on the street. A well-chosen coat could open doors that birth alone might not, and a shabby one could close them just as firmly. It is, in its own strange and expensive way, one more language spoken fluently across every level of Georgian society, understood instantly by everyone, however differently each rank chooses to speak it. For those with money, leisure, and a fashionable ailment or two, no destination carries quite the same social cachet as a spa town, and none more so than the elegant crescents and colonnades of Bath. Word has spread for decades that the mineral-rich waters bubbling up from beneath the town possess genuine healing properties, and the wealthy travel from across the country, and occasionally from abroad, to drink the waters, bathe in them, and just as importantly, to see and be seen by the very best society the season has to offer. The daily routine of a fashionable visitor to Bath follows an almost ritual pattern. Early mornings bring a visit to the pump room, where the mineral waters are dispensed by the glass to those hopping for relief from gout, rheumatism, digestive complaints, or simply the general malaise that seems to afflict so many idle members of polite society. The water itself is warm, faintly unpleasant in taste, and drunk with real devotion by patients convinced, often against all evidence, that it is doing them genuine good. Bathing follows for those who prefer full immersion, men and women alike lowering themselves into the warm public baths in specially designed bathing costumes, floating gently while attendants and fellow bathers exchange the latest gossip. But the true business of Bath, beneath all the talk of healing waters, is social. The town exists as an enormous, elegant marriage market and social proving ground, where families bring marriageable sons and daughters in hopes of a fortunate match, where fortunes are won and lost at the card tables of the assembly rooms, and where a person standing can rise or fall dramatically over the course of a single season based on nothing more substantial than who they were seen dining with, and who they were not. Master of ceremonies figures preside over the town's elaborate social calendar, enforcing an unwritten but rigidly understood code of manners and precedents that determines exactly who may be introduced to whom, and in what order. The architecture itself reflects this obsession with display. Grand crescents of pale stone houses curve elegantly along the hillsides, their uniform facades hiding a considerable variation in the wealth and standing of the families renting rooms behind them. A fashionable address matters enormously, and visitors calculate carefully how much they can afford to spend on lodging that will properly reflect, or perhaps slightly exceed, their actual social standing back home. The whole town runs, in effect, on the careful management of appearances, an entire economy built around the simple human desire to look, for one glittering season, rather grander than one perhaps truly is. Beneath the elegance, of course, the same inequalities found everywhere else in Georgian England persist quietly. The servants who dress the fashionable visitors, carry their sedan chairs through the streets, and staff the baths and pump rooms work the same long, invisible hours found in any grand townhouse, for the same meager wages. The waters themselves, whatever genuine mineral benefit they might offer, are drunk just as enthusiastically by patients whose real ailments medicine of this century has no actual means of curing, spa treatment functioning, in the end. Rather like the quack doctor's tonic, a genuine comfort to believe in, whatever its actual medical merit turns out to be. If honor sends Georgian gentlemen to a quiet field at dawn, ordinary appetite for risk sends them, considerably more often, to the gaming table instead. Gambling runs through every level of Georgian society like a fever, from aristocratic gentlemen losing entire estates across a single reckless night of cards, to laborers wagering their week's wages on a cockfight or the turn of a coin. It is, without much exaggeration, one of the defining pastimes of the age, woven into taverns, private clubs, coffee houses, and grand assembly rooms alike. Among the fashionable, dedicated gaming clubs spring up in the better parts of London, elegant establishments where gentlemen gather nightly to play cards and dice for stakes that would support an ordinary family for a decade or more. Fortunes are won and lost with startling speed, family estates mortgaged or sold outright to cover a single catastrophic night's losses, and more than one aristocratic family's decline can be traced directly back to a father or a son who simply could not stop playing once the cards were dealt. The clubs themselves profit handsomely regardless of who wins or loses at any individual table, taking their cut through membership fees and the general expenses of running a fashionable establishment, giving the house every incentive to keep the games running long into the night. For those without a fortune to lose, gambling takes humbler but no less devoted forms. Lotteries, run both officially by the state and unofficially by private operators, sell tickets to hopeful buyers across every social rank, the promise of a life-changing prize drawing in laborers and shopkeepers who can barely spare the ticket price, let alone absorb the loss if their number fails to come up. Betting on blood sports, on horse races, on the outcome of a boxing match, or even a simple foot race down the street, provides a steady outlet for the gambling impulse among those who will never see the inside of a fashionable club. The appeal across every class isn't hard to understand in a century that offers so little genuine security to anyone. For the poor, a lucky wager offers a rare, real chance at escaping grinding poverty in a single stroke, however unlikely the actual odds. For the wealthy, gambling offers something closer to sport, a way of testing nerve and fortune among peers in a society that otherwise offers relatively few outlets for genuine risk and excitement. Reformers and moralists alike decry the practice loudly throughout the century, warning of ruined families and wasted fortunes, and there's real truth behind their warnings. But the tables stay full regardless, the dice keep rolling, and the promise of a fortune won in a single throw proves, for Georgians rich and poor alike, simply too tempting to resist. Down along the river, past the taverns and warehouses, London's docks hum with an activity that quietly powers a great deal of the wealth glittering in the fashionable townhouses further inland. Ships arrive constantly from across a growing empire and beyond it, unloading sugar, tobacco, cotton, and tea, alongside a great many other goods that fill the shops and sweeten the tea tables of Georgian England. It is worth pausing honestly on where a considerable portion of that wealth actually comes from, because the comfortable prosperity of this century rests, in real and significant part, on the transatlantic slave trade, an ongoing horror that runs alongside everything else described in this account. British ships carry enslaved men, women, and children from West Africa across the Atlantic to labor on plantations in the Caribbean and the Americas, producing the sugar that sweetens the very tea being poured in London drawing rooms, and the raw cotton that will, by the century's end, feed the new mills discussed earlier in growing quantities. The conditions of that crossing, known to history as the Middle Passage, are almost unimaginably brutal, and the labor awaiting survivors on the plantations at the other end offers little relief from that brutality. Fortunes made in this trade, and in the plantation economies it sustains, flow directly back into Georgian Britain, funding grand country houses, fashionable townhouses, and no small number of the comfortable lives described throughout this very account. For most ordinary Georgians going about their daily lives, drinking their sweetened tea, wearing their cotton clothing, buying their tobacco, the human cost behind these goods remains largely out of sight, and for many, out of mind entirely, in much the same way the climbing boy in the chimney or the servant behind the hidden door remains unseen by the family enjoying the comfort their labor provides. It is a pattern that runs throughout this century in one form after another, comfort at one end of a long chain, built on suffering carefully kept out of view at the other. Toward the latter part of the Georgian era, a genuine and increasingly vocal abolitionist movement gathers real strength, campaigning tirelessly against the trade through public meetings, pamphlets, and sustained pressure on Parliament itself. Formerly enslaved writers and speakers add their own direct testimony to the growing public argument, describing the trade's realities in terms that prove increasingly difficult for the wider public to ignore entirely. The trade itself is finally abolished within the British Empire before the Georgian era fully closes, though slavery as an institution persists somewhat longer still in British colonies, and the full reckoning with this chapter of the era's history extends, in truth, well beyond the century itself and into ongoing conversation today. It stands as one more example of a hard truth already threaded through this entire account, that the elegance and comfort so associated with this age were very often purchased at a cost paid almost entirely by people the comfortable classes never had to look directly in the eye. We've already met the press gang and felt the terror of being seized off a dark street and hauled toward the sea. But what exactly awaits the man who actually ends up serving aboard one of His Majesty's warships deserves its own careful look, because life below decks turns out to be its own particular kind of hardship, distinct from anything found on land, yet every bit as demanding of a person's endurance. A warship of any real size is, in effect, a small floating town, packed with several hundred men living, eating, sleeping, and working within a remarkably confined space for months or even years at a stretch. Space is the scarcest resource aboard, and an ordinary sailor's world shrinks down to a hammock slung barely more than a foot from his neighbors, swaying gently with the roll of the ship through every watch of the night. Headroom below decks is often so limited that a man of any real height learns quickly to stoop, and privacy of any kind is simply not a concept the Navy has much use for. The daily routine runs on a rigid schedule of watches, dividing the crew into shifts that keep the ship functioning around the clock, hauling sail, manning the pumps, standing lookout, and performing the endless maintenance a wooden vessel constantly demands simply to stay afloat and seaworthy. Discipline is enforced harshly, flogging remaining a standard punishment for offenses that might range from genuine insubordination to something as minor as a poorly stowed piece of equipment, the lash administered before the assembled crew as both punishment and public warning. Food aboard ship follows its own grim logic, built around what will actually survive a long voyage without spoiling entirely. Salted meat, so heavily preserved it requires soaking before it can even be chewed properly. Hardtack biscuit, baked dense and dry enough to last for months, though rarely without attracting its own population of weevils by the later weeks of a long voyage. A daily ration of rum, watered down into a mixture sailors come to know well, offers one of the few genuine comforts available in an otherwise punishing routine. Fresh food, when available at all, comes only during brief stops in port, and scurvy, born of the long absence of anything resembling fresh fruit or vegetables, remains a real and dreaded danger on extended voyages, even as understanding of its cause slowly, unevenly spreads through the naval medical establishment over the course of the century. Beyond the daily grind, there is always the real prospect of battle, and naval combat in this era is a genuinely terrifying affair, wooden ships firing heavy iron cannonballs at close range, sending showers of splinters tearing through packed decks with a lethality that often exceeds the cannonballs themselves. Surgeons aboard, working with instruments not so different from those bleeding patients back on land, perform amputations at a furious pace during and after any serious engagement. The wounded laid out in rows with little more than a leather strap to bite down on against the pain. And yet, for all its hardship, naval service offers something too: a trade, a wage, however modest and however late in arriving, and for the genuinely skilled sailor, a real path toward advancement that birth alone might never have offered on land. Some men, pressed unwillingly into service, come in time to find real purpose and even pride in the life, rising through the ranks on ability alone in a way few other Georgian institutions permit. It is a hard, dangerous, unforgiving existence, but it is also, for the nation as a whole, the very thing standing between Britain and invasion, its trade routes, and much of the wealth flowing through those docks discussed earlier, the fleet quietly underwriting the comfortable prosperity enjoyed by those who never once have to set foot aboard a ship themselves. Away from the grand spectacles of hanging days and theater nights, the true rhythm of ordinary Georgian commerce plays out on market day, a weekly event around which entire towns organize themselves, and one of the few occasions when town and countryside meet face to face in real numbers. Farmers arrive before dawn with carts loaded with produce, livestock driven in on foot along dusty roads, and by mid-morning the market square hums with a controlled chaos of buying, selling, haggling, and outright shouting that would strike a quieter modern shopper as something close to bedlam in its own right. Stalls spread across the square selling everything an ordinary household might need: vegetables and fruit in season, fresh eggs and butter carried in from nearby farms, cuts of meat hanging in open air with little protection from flies or dust, bolts of cloth, second-hand clothing, pots and pans, and an endless variety of small household goods. Prices are rarely fixed, and haggling forms an essential, almost theatrical part of every transaction, buyer and seller circling verbally around a final figure that both can live with, each side performing outrage or reluctance as the negotiation demands. Livestock markets run alongside the general produce trade: cattle, sheep, and pigs driven in from surrounding farms and sold in noisy pens, the air thick with the particular smell of penned animals, and the shouted bids of dealers working the crowd. For farmers, market day represents the culmination of weeks or months of labor, the moment when crops and livestock finally convert into the coin needed to pay rent, buy supplies, and keep a family going through the coming season. A poor harvest or a bad run of prices on market day can mean genuine hardship stretching out across an entire year, tying the fortunes of rural families directly to the unpredictable churn of weather and demand. Beyond simple commerce, market day serves as the great social and informational hub of rural life. News travels here faster than almost anywhere else outside the city coffee house, farmers and townsfolk alike exchanging word of politics, local scandal, and events from neighboring parishes. It's often the only regular occasion when scattered rural families, isolated across their farms and cottages the rest of the week, gather together in real numbers, and matches are made, friendships renewed, and disputes both settled and started amid the noise and bustle of the stalls. Traveling entertainers frequently time their arrival to coincide with market day, drawing on the larger crowds it brings to town, jugglers, musicians, and the very quack doctors discussed earlier, all setting up, alongside the produce stalls, to catch the attention of a public with a little coin, freshly in hand from the morning's trading. By evening, the market square empties out, stalls packed away, livestock driven home or to new owners, and the town settles back into its quieter weekday rhythm, until the whole cycle begins again the following week. The steady, essential heartbeat beneath everything else described throughout this account. In a century without telephone or telegraph, the written letter carries a weight almost impossible to fully appreciate from the instant messaging world of today. And the postal service that carries those letters across Georgian England forms one more quiet thread holding the whole scattered nation together. A letter posted in London might take several days to reach a recipient in a distant county, carried along by a relay of mail coaches and postal riders working in careful sequence to keep the correspondence of a nation moving, however slowly by later standards. The cost of sending a letter falls, through most of the century, on the recipient rather than the sender, a system that produces its own small comedies and genuine hardships in roughly equal measure. A poor family receiving word from a son gone off to sea, or a daughter sent into service in a distant town, must find the postage fee before they can even read what's inside. And more than one Georgian household has had to send a letter back unopened simply because the money for its collection wasn't available that particular week. Wealthier correspondents sometimes exploit small loopholes in the system, scrawling brief coded messages on the outside of a folded letter that a recipient could read and understand without ever paying to actually open it. A small, quietly clever act of resistance against a fee system that falls hardest on those who can least afford it. For families separated by service, by transportation, by naval duty, or simply by the ordinary demands of finding work in a distant town, letters represent the only real thread of connection across long absences. A mother whose son has been pressed into naval service waits anxiously for word that might not arrive for months, if it arrives at all, and the arrival of a letter, good news or bad, becomes a genuine event in a household's week. Letters are read aloud where literacy is limited, shared among neighbors and relatives, sometimes kept and reread for years afterward, treasured as one of the few tangible connections to a loved one far away. For those who can afford it, and for the growing middle class in particular, letter writing becomes something of an art form in its own right, with elaborate conventions governing everything from proper forms of address to the correct way to close a letter to a social superior versus an equal or a familiar friend. Entire guidebooks circulate offering model letters for every conceivable occasion, proposing marriage, declining an invitation, offering condolences, seeking employment, allowing even those uncertain of their own prose to navigate the genuinely complex social rules governing written correspondence in this status-conscious century. Beyond personal letters, the postal network carries newspapers, pamphlets, and business correspondence that keeps trade and information flowing across the country, supplementing the coffeehouse gossip and market day chatter described earlier with something closer to a genuine national communication system, however slow and expensive by later standards. It is, in its own understated way, one of the quiet infrastructural achievements of the Georgian age, a thread of paper and ink stretching across hundreds of miles of poor roads and uncertain weather, carrying love, grief, business, and news steadily onward, letter by letter, toward whatever destination awaited at the other end. We've already seen how poverty could send a small boy up a chimney or into a cotton mill, but for a great many Georgian children, The path into working life runs instead through formal apprenticeship, a system that, at its best, offers a genuine trade and a real future, and at its worst, differs from outright servitude only in the paperwork attached to it. A boy, and occasionally a girl, is bound by legal indenture to a master craftsman for a term of years, typically 7, during which the apprentice owes the master labor and obedience in exchange for training, food, lodging, and the promise of a trade at the end of it all. For families with some small means, apprenticeship represents a real investment in a child's future, a fee paid up front to secure a place with a reputable master in a trade offering genuine prospects. A printer, a goldsmith, a cabinet maker, a solicitor's clerk. The better sort of master takes real pride in training his apprentices properly, treating them essentially as junior members of the household, feeding them at his own table, correcting their manners alongside their craft, and genuinely invested in seeing them succeed, since a well-trained apprentice reflects well on the master who trained him. But for children from the parish workhouse, or from families with no means to pay any fee at all, apprenticeship often looks considerably grimmer. Parish authorities, eager to move children off the poor rates and onto someone else's household budget, bind orphans and pauper children to whatever master will take them, with little real concern for the quality of training or treatment on offer. These pauper apprenticeships frequently go to trades nobody would choose voluntarily, chimney sweeping, as we've already seen, being among the very worst, or to the new cotton mills hungry for cheap, compliant labor, the parish effectively washing its hands of responsibility for a child the moment the indenture is signed. The apprentice's daily life, whatever the trade, follows a rhythm dictated entirely by the master. Long hours of labor, often unpaid beyond basic food and lodging, fill most waking hours, with whatever actual instruction in the craft happening in whatever time remains once the day's more menial tasks are complete. Discipline can be harsh, physical correction, widely accepted as a legitimate tool for keeping an apprentice in line, and a master with a genuinely cruel temperament faces relatively little real oversight or consequence for how he treats those bound to him. Running away from an apprenticeship is itself a criminal offense in many circumstances, trapping unhappy apprentices in situations a modern eye would recognize immediately as exploitative, with the law standing firmly on the master's side rather than the child's. For girls, apprenticeship opportunities remain considerably narrower than for boys, generally confined to trades like dressmaking, millinery, or domestic service, training that prepares a young woman for either a modest independent trade or, more commonly, eventual work as a servant in someone else's household. The apprenticeship years, for a fortunate few, genuinely do open doors that poverty alone would have kept firmly shut, a skilled trade offering real independence and even modest prosperity once the term is finally served. For many others, the years simply pass in hard, unpaid labor, the promised trade never quite materializing into anything resembling the future it was meant to secure. One more example of a system that works reasonably well for those who enter it from a position of some existing advantage, and considerably less well for those who enter it with nothing at all. For all the grinding hardship documented throughout this account, the Georgian calendar is not entirely without its bright spots, and certain days throughout the year offer genuine, welcome breaks from the ordinary grind of labor and survival. Christmas, though celebrated with less of the elaborate ritual later centuries will attach to it, still brings a welcome pause in the working year, families gathering where distance and circumstance allow, a slightly better meal than usual finding its way to even modest tables, and church attendance marking the religious heart of the occasion for most ordinary Georgians. The feast itself, for those who can manage it, might include roast beef or goose, plum pudding rich with dried fruit and spices that represent a real, saved-for extravagance for poorer families, and perhaps a bit of that suspiciously adulterated wine or beer discussed earlier, brought out specially for the occasion. Wealthier households mark the season with considerably more elaborate entertaining, but even modest cottages find some way to mark the day as different from the 51 ordinary weeks surrounding it. Candles lit a little more freely, neighbors visiting with small gifts of food or goodwill. Beyond Christmas, the calendar carries a whole scattered array of local fairs, saints' days, and harvest celebrations, each with its own regional customs and traditions passed down through generations largely by word of mouth rather than any written record. May Day brings dancing and flowers in many villages, a genuine, joyful celebration of spring after a long, hard winter. Harvest Home, celebrated once the last of the crop is safely gathered in, offers agricultural laborers a rare moment of collective celebration and rest, the whole community gathering for a feast that marks both an ending and, implicitly, real relief that the year's hardest labor is finally behind them for another season. Traveling fairs, timed often to coincide with these seasonal markers, bring a burst of genuine color and excitement to towns that see little enough of either through the ordinary working year. Alongside the trading of livestock and goods already discussed under Market Day, these larger seasonal fairs draw traveling entertainers in real numbers. Acrobats, musicians, puppet shows, and the human exhibits discussed earlier in this account, all competing for the attention and the coin of a crowd finally freed, for a day or two, from its usual labor. These holidays and feast days matter enormously precisely because ordinary Georgian life offers so little built-in respite otherwise. There is no concept yet of the paid holiday, no guaranteed weekend rest for most laborers beyond perhaps a portion of Sunday, and the working year grinds on relentlessly for most ordinary people described throughout this account. Against that backdrop, a feast day, a fair, a rare shared celebration carries real weight, a brief treasured reminder that life in this hard century contains genuine joy alongside all its very real hardship, that the same people enduring gin-soaked mornings, adulterated bread and grinding daily labor also find their way, again and again, toward music, toward feasting, toward the simple, stubborn human pleasure of celebrating together whenever the calendar, and their own hard-won circumstances, finally allow it. With so much crime, cruelty, and danger threaded through this account, it's worth asking a fairly obvious question. Who, exactly, is meant to be keeping order through all of this? For most of the Georgian era, the honest answer is remarkably little in the way of organized policing at all. There is no dedicated police force patrolling the streets in any form a later century would readily recognize. And what passes for law enforcement instead is a patchwork of aging traditions, part-time volunteers, and privately funded initiatives that leave enormous gaps for crime to slip comfortably through. The night watchman represents the oldest and most familiar face of this patchwork system, an older man, often poorly paid and sometimes not especially fit for more strenuous work, who walks an assigned round through the streets after dark, calling out the hour and keeping a general, largely ceremonial eye out for trouble. Armed with little more than a lantern, a wooden rattle to summon assistance, and perhaps a staff for his own modest protection, the watchman is, in practice, poorly equipped to confront serious criminals, and popular opinion of the time treats the whole institution with something close to open mockery. Watchmen frequently portrayed in plays and satirical prints as elderly, easily deceived figures more likely to be tricked or overpowered than to actually prevent a crime in progress. Parish constables supplement the watchmen, ordinary citizens selected, often reluctantly, to serve unpaid terms enforcing basic order within their local parish, a civic duty many regard as a burden to be avoided rather than an honor to be sought. Untrained, unpaid, and serving only limited terms before handing the burden to the next reluctant neighbor, parish constables offer little real deterrent to determined criminals, and the system relies heavily on ordinary citizens simply choosing, for the most part, not to break the law, rather than on any genuine expectation of being caught if they do. Toward the latter part of the Georgian era, genuine reform finally begins to stir. A dedicated group of paid, professional thief-takers, working initially out of a single London magistrate's office, begins pursuing criminals with real, systematic effort, offering an early glimpse of what organized, professional policing might eventually look like. These early officers achieve real, if limited, success against the city's worst offenders, developing methods of investigation and pursuit considerably more sophisticated than anything the old watch system ever attempted. And their example gradually influences thinking about how a growing, increasingly crowded city might actually be kept in order. Private initiative fills in still more of the gaps left by this patchwork public system. Wealthy merchants and property owners frequently fund their own private watchmen to patrol valuable warehouses and docks. Insurance companies employ agents with a direct financial interest in preventing theft and fraud. And ordinary citizens, lacking real confidence that official channels will actually recover stolen property, sometimes turn to advertised rewards, offering payment for the safe return of goods, with, pointedly, no questions asked about how the thief came to possess them in the first place. A practice that inadvertently creates its own small, quiet economy around the return of stolen property. The genuine, organized police force that later centuries take entirely for granted lies still some years beyond the close of the Georgian era proper. Its eventual creation drawing directly on the lessons, frustrations, and limited successes of this whole patchwork system described here. For now, though, order in Georgian England remains something closer to a shared social project than a professional service. Watchmen calling the hour, reluctant constables serving their unpaid terms, private guards protecting valuable property, and ordinary citizens simply hopping, on any given night, that trouble passes them by rather than finding them out. It is one more thread running through this entire long day. The quiet, constant awareness that the protection of the law, such as it is, remains thin, unevenly distributed, and never quite as reliable as a person might genuinely wish it to be. And so, at last, our long day in Georgian England draws slowly toward its close. You have woken up folded over a rope in a crowded lodging house, stepped carefully around the contents of a stranger's chamber pot, and settled your nerves with a cup of gin before the sun had properly risen. You have painted your face with poison to look fashionable, balanced a lice-ridden monument of powdered hair on your head, and eaten bread that may well have contained more chalk than flour. You have watched small children sent up chimneys and into mills, wondered at a medical system built almost entirely on bleeding the sick, and closed your mouth carefully around teeth you were genuinely grateful to still possess. You have seen the sick put on display for a paying crowd's amusement, and watched a whole city turn a hanging into a festival complete with pie sellers and printed ballads. You have hurried past a body swinging in iron chains at a crossroads, and given a churchyard a wide berth after dark for fear of what might be dug up before morning. You have learned that a stolen handkerchief and a brutal murder might, with terrible bad luck, carry exactly the same sentence, and that a debt too large to pay could cost you years of freedom rather than simply money. You have kept to well-lit streets to avoid the press gang, guarded your tongue in fashionable company to avoid a duel at dawn, and watched crowds cheer at cruelty to animals with no apparent unease at all. You have thought of the newborns sent away to wet nurses in distant cottages, and of the tiny tokens left behind in a drawer at the foundling hospital, each one a small, silent goodbye that mostly never found its way back to the mother who left it. You have felt the weight of a century that lived remarkably close to death, and met that closeness not with despair but with ritual, with mourning jewelry made from a loved one's own hair, with a quiet, stubborn tenderness that somehow persisted despite everything working against it. You have watched marriages arranged like business mergers among the wealthy, and hurried into existence in the shadow of a debtor's prison among the poor. You have walked past a smuggler's cellar, ducked beneath the smoke pouring from 1,000 coal fires, and slipped, gratefully, into a cheap seat at the theater for one warm hour of shared human delight before the candle finally gutters, and the day is truly done. It would be easy, from the comfortable distance of your own century, to simply laugh at the powdered wigs and the chalk-laced bread, to shake your head at the gin-soaked mornings and the towering hairstyles crawling with lice. And there is, admittedly, real absurdity here, threaded through nearly every hour of this long, strange day. But behind every absurd detail were real people, doing their genuine best within a world that offered them remarkably little room to maneuver. They endured filth, hunger, and hardship that we today can scarcely picture from the safety of a warm, well-lit room. They buried far too many of their children, far too young, and somehow kept on loving anyway, kept on building families and homes and small, ordinary hopes for the future. They lived close to death their entire lives and met it, again and again, not with despair but with ceremony, with keepsakes, with a stubborn, tender resilience that genuinely deserves our quiet respect all these years later. They were not, in the end, so very different from us. They simply had none of the comforts we lean on today without a second thought. No clean water at the turn of a tap, no medicine that actually understood what it was treating, no assurance that the bread on the table was really bread at all. So tonight, as you settle into your own clean, warm bed, with safe water waiting in the tap and real medicine on the shelf and air outside that will not slowly choke you as you sleep, spare a gentle thought for them. For the climbing boys and the mill children, the servants laboring invisibly below stairs, the mothers who gave up everything they had for a chance their children might simply survive. The ordinary souls who carried the weight of that hard, remarkable age on their own backs, so that easier ages, including this one, might one day follow after them. They endured the worst of it in their own quiet, unremarked way so that you might drift off tonight into the very best of it. Rest easy now. You have, in every sense, earned it. Good night.